Good evening and welcome back. Tonight we're diving into the fascinating world of the Roman-Persian Wars, a sprawling centuries-long contest between two of the ancient world's greatest empires. As always, let me know where in the world you're listening from and what time it is for you. Get cozy, settle in, and let's begin. Congratulations! You've just woken up in the year 92 BCE. At the end of the 2nd century before the Common Era, the eastern sky of the Mediterranean world was tinged with the red glow of shifting powers. The old Seleucid Empire, once a dominant heir to Alexander the Great's conquests, was fading. Once stretching from the Aegean to the borders of India, it had splintered into fragile fragments, its kings now more regional landlords than imperial rulers. Into that void of eastern power, a new force began to stir. Parthia, a horse-lord kingdom rising from the Iranian plateau. Its people, descendants of the nomadic Parni, were expert riders and archers, famed for the so-called Parthian shot, the deadly backwards bow shot, while retreating on horseback. But more than warriors, they were shrewd politicians, slowly building an empire brick by brick, through diplomacy and calculated warfare. And to their west, Rome. Rome was, by this time, well on its way to becoming the superpower of the Mediterranean. After the defeat of Carthage and the absorption of Greece, Roman influence extended across the sea like an ever-growing ripple. But the Republic, for it was still a republic then, if in name, more than in practice, had not yet fully reckoned with the lands far to the east. The meeting point of these rising forces, Rome and Parthia, was a land of ancient cities, holy sites and strategic crossroads, Syria and Mesopotamia. And so our story begins with not a grand battle, but a quiet negotiation. In 92 BCE, a Roman envoy named Sulla, yes, that's Sulla, who would later become dictator of Rome, met with a Parthian ambassador near the river Euphrates. The two men, representing the great powers of West and East, reportedly greeted each other with courtesy. There were no drawn swords, no fanfare, just a simple acknowledgement. This river, the Euphrates, would for now mark the boundary between their spheres. It was not a treaty written in stone, but a whisper of what was to come. The Romans were busy with internal strife and wars in the west. The Parthians had their own eastern rivals to watch. Yet even then the Euphrates began to glimmer, not as a border of peace, but as a line of tension. A few years later, events in the region would begin to draw the two empires closer to conflict. To the north, in the rugged mountains of Armenia, a powerful and ambitious king was rising, Tigranes II, better known to history as Tigranes the Great. Once a hostage in Parthia, he had returned to claim his throne with Parthian support. But now, flush with success, he began to turn away from his patrons and look westward to Syria, Phoenicia, and even parts of Anatolia. Tigranes built a court of splendor in his new capital, Tigranocerta, drawing scholars, artists, and soldiers from across the region. His ambitions made him a king of kings in name and demeanor, and his growing empire pressed against both Roman and Parthian interests. He even married Cleopatra, not the Egyptian queen, but a Seleucid princess, a symbolic gesture that tied him to the fading Seleucid legacy. In 88 BCE, Mithridates VI of Pontus, another eastern king with an axe to grind against Rome, launched a rebellion that spread across Asia Minor. He massacred thousands of Roman citizens and allies in what would become known as the Asiatic Vespers. Tigranes, his son-in-law and occasional ally, stood by as Mithridates struck. Rome could not ignore such a challenge. The Senate dispatched Lucius Cornelius Sulla, who had just completed a bloody siege in Athens, to confront Mithridates. What followed was the First Mithridatic War, a brutal campaign of maneuver, siege, and diplomacy. By 85 BCE, a weary peace was signed between Sulla and Mithridates at Dardanus. Yet the East had changed. While Sulla dealt with Mithridates, Tigranes had continued his expansion, seizing former Seleucid lands, including Syria, and styling himself a rival to both Parthian and a Roman supremacy. The Parthians, cautious yet calculating, began to see in Rome a potential counterweight to Armenian ambitions. And so, Paradoxically, the first whispers of Roman-Parthian cooperation emerged not out of alliance, but mutual distrust of a common neighbour. The borderlands, the dry plains of northern Mesopotamia, the fertile valleys of the Tigris and Euphrates, the caravan routes winding through Palmyra, became chessboards, each square watched closely. Armies had not yet clashed in full, but the pieces were moving, the echoes of empire, 85-66 BCE. As we move deeper into the 1st century before the Common Era, the world between Rome and Parthia grows more complex, more entangled. Each kingdom, each satrapy and province now acts like a loose thread in a great and growing tapestry, and it takes only a single tug to unravel order into war. The Romans, victorious but exhausted from the First Mithridatic War, had gained little in material terms. Their influence in Asia Minor had been reasserted, but not yet secured. As Sulla returned to Rome to face civil war and eventual dictatorship, the eastern frontier was left to stew, unguarded by any lasting peace or imperial strategy. In Armenia, Tigranes the Great stood at the height of his power. His kingdom stretched from the Caspian Sea to the Mediterranean, absorbing former Seleucid lands and shadowing the old imperial cities of Antioch and Damascus. Though still nominally allied with Mithridates of Pontus, Tigranes acted increasingly alone, and increasingly like a man who believed himself the centre of the world. He ruled in grandeur, drawing artists and philosophers to his glittering capital of Tigranokerta. There, amid gardens, palaces, and echoing marble halls, Tigranes fashioned himself as the equal of Rome and Parthia both. His court was multilingual, cosmopolitan, and radiant, a place where Persian satraps rubbed shoulders with Greek scholars, and Eastern warriors shared wine with Mediterranean diplomats. Yet his growing might unsettled the region. The Parthians, who had helped raise Tigranes to power, now viewed him with unease. He had not only outgrown his reliance on their goodwill, he had begun to rival their influence in Mesopotamia. And the Romans, though distracted, could not long ignore a new Eastern Empire rising under their watch. The next trigger came, once again, from Pontus. Mithridates VI, refusing to accept his diminished role after the First Mithridatic War, spent nearly a decade rebuilding his army, forging new alliances and preparing for revenge. His appeals stretched from the shores of the Black Sea to the steppes of Scythia, but perhaps most importantly, to Armenia. Tigranes received his father-in-law with honour, though perhaps not with enthusiasm. Still, he offered sanctuary. And when Mithridates returned to Pontus in 74 BCE to spark a second rebellion against Rome, Tigranes was watching carefully. Rome responded with more force this time. A young and rising general, Lucius Licinius Lucullus, was dispatched east to deal with the threat. Lucullus was a complex figure, brilliant, aristocratic, and deeply interested in Greek culture. His campaigns in Asia Minor and Pontus would be marked by logistical acumen and swift battlefield manoeuvring. But it was not Mithridates alone that he would confront. It was also the question of Armenia. In 72 BCE, Mithridates was defeated again and fled, this time not to the sea but to the sanctuary of his son-in-law. Tigranes, bound by honour and dynasty, refused to surrender him, and thus the Roman-Armenian War began. Lucullus did not hesitate. In 69 BCE, he led a bold invasion into Armenian territory. It was a daring move, the first real extension of Roman arms beyond Asia Minor into the highlands of the Armenian plateau. His legions moved through harsh terrain, crossing rivers and mountains through forests and winter winds. Tigranes, caught by surprise, fled the advancing Romans. His new capital, Tigranocerta, meant to be a jewel of the East, was besieged. Lucullus, commanding perhaps fewer than 15,000 men, faced a much larger Armenian force. But Roman discipline, clever use of terrain, and the untested nature of Tigranes' levied army led to a stunning Roman victory. The city fell. Tigranes escaped. It was a dramatic moment, but not a decisive one. Armenia's rugged geography allowed Tigranes to retreat and regroup. Lucullus, despite his success, found it increasingly difficult to hold territory. His men, worn by long campaigns and harsh winters, grew mutinous. His political enemies in Rome, particularly the rising star Pompey the Great, began to question his strategy, and all the while the Parthians watched. They had remained officially neutral. But neutrality in such times was not a passive act. The Parthians played host to envoys from all sides. They secured their own borders, reinforced their cities along the Tigris, and waited for their chance. In 66 BCE, with Lucullus recalled and Roman strategy shifting, Pompey was given supreme command in the east. His appointment marked the beginning of a new phase in Rome's engagement with the Eastern world, and with it, the first serious diplomatic dances between Pompey and the Parthian king, Phraates III. The time of cautious greetings was ending. The empires were learning each other's languages, testing each other's strengths, and the wars, for there would be many, were beginning to whisper on the horizon. The tapestry was tightening. Pompey and the shadow of Parthia, 66-53 BCE. The year is 66 BCE, and a tall, self-assured Roman general rides eastward under banners of Senate-given command. His name is Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus, Pompey the Great. At just 40 years old, Pompey has already eclipsed many of his peers. With victories in Hispania, Africa, and the pirate-infested waters of the eastern Mediterranean, he now carries the near-total authority of Rome's eastern campaigns. What lies before him are not just rebellious kings, but the subtle challenge of diplomacy, the weight of unsteady alliances, and a rising empire beyond the Euphrates. Pompey's first task was to secure the region. He moved quickly, his legions disciplined and efficient. In swift strokes he dealt with Mithridates VI of Pontus, driving the aging monarch into exile, where, in a lonely mountain fortress, Mithridates eventually took his own life. The threat from Pontus was extinguished, but the embers of eastern unrest remained. Tigranes the Great of Armenia, wearied from his losses to Lucullus, submitted to Pompey. The terms were mild. He was allowed to keep his throne, albeit as a Roman client. His son, rebellious and headstrong, was taken into Roman custody. In one stroke, Pompey pacified a key region without further bloodshed, displaying the sort of pragmatic diplomacy that would mark his eastern tenure. With Pontus and Armenia settled, the next question loomed: Parthia. To the Parthians, Pompey's rapid victories must have seemed both impressive and unsettling. Their king, Phraates III, ruled from Ctesiphon near the banks of the Tigris. His court was one of ceremony and suspicion. For the Parthian aristocracy, noble houses known as the Seven Clans held great sway. Unlike Rome, where power was centralized through consuls and senators, Parthia's rulers were constantly balancing the demands of court factions, nobles, and local governors. Pompey did not invade Parthian territory. He had no Senate mandate for such a war. Instead, he pursued a cautious course, seeking to define borders and exert pressure without full confrontation. In 64 BCE, Roman and Parthian diplomats met to reaffirm the Euphrates as the de facto boundary between the two realms. It was not a treaty of friendship, but a mutual understanding. Rome would not press beyond Syria and Armenia. Parthia, in turn, would keep to the eastern side of the river. It was a line drawn in sand, respected for now. And yet, in 63 BCE, Pompey made a bold and symbolic move. He formally annexed what remained of the Seleucid Empire, the once proud realm of Antiochus, and made Syria a Roman province. With this, Rome now shared a border with Parthia directly. The old Greek world was gone, folded into the Republic's embrace. Parthia did not respond militarily. Instead, it turned inward. Phraates III soon faced a deeper threat than Roman diplomacy: his own sons. Orodes and Mithridates, hungry for power, began to conspire. The Parthian tradition of succession was not primogeniture. It was often fratricidal and chaotic. In 57 BCE, Mithridates rebelled. Phraates was murdered, likely by one or both of his sons. This would prove a dangerous time for Parthia. Mithridates briefly seized the throne but was driven out by Orodes, who now ruled as king. Mithridates fled, not east but west, into Roman territory. This is where the story moves toward its fateful crossroads. The Roman governor of Syria was Marcus Licinius Crassus, immensely wealthy, politically ambitious, and yearning for military glory to rival Pompey and Julius Caesar. Crassus saw in Parthia both a threat and an opportunity. When Mithridates appealed for Roman help to reclaim his throne, Crassus saw his opening. The Senate was divided, but Crassus secured his command, largely through influence and his share of the so-called First Triumvirate with Pompey and Caesar. And so, in 54 BCE, Crassus crossed the Euphrates with 7 legions. He had little understanding of the land or the people he was invading. Parthia was no ordinary kingdom. Its military relied not on rigid infantry formations, but on mobility and shock. Their elite horse archers could ride in wide, sweeping formations, firing deadly arrows while retreating. And at the center of their force, the cataphracts, heavy cavalry clad in armor, charging with lances that could shatter Roman lines. As Crassus pushed deeper into Mesopotamia, his army began to suffer from the open plains and hostile terrain. Supplies grew thin, local populations were uncooperative, and then came word that a Parthian force was moving to intercept him, led by a general named Surena. Surena was young, charismatic, and cunning. He brought with him perhaps 10,000 horsemen, but what they lacked in numbers they made up for in precision and timing. Crassus, despite warnings from allies and scouts, marched his men into the flat, dry expanse near Carrhae. It was there, in 53 BCE, that Rome and Parthia finally met in full-scale battle, but that is a story deserving of its own breath and pace. For the Battle of Carrhae would be not just a clash of armies, but of civilizations and ways of war. It would echo for centuries. The sands of Carrhae, 53 BCE. Let us turn now to the plains of northern Mesopotamia. The air is dry, the ground parched and stony, and the distant horizon shimmers under the late spring sun. It is here, near a small town called Carrhae, on the borderlands between Roman-controlled Syria and the vast open reaches of Parthia, that the ambitions of Marcus Licinius Crassus meet their grim reckoning. Crassus had entered the campaign with supreme confidence. His army, composed of over 40,000 men, 7 legions, cavalry and auxiliaries, marched with the proud bearing of the Roman military machine. Yet the land they now traversed was not like Gaul, nor like the mountains of Spain or the cities of Greece. It was open, windswept, and largely empty. There were no towns to seize, no forests to conceal formations, only a vast stage upon which Parthian strategy could unfold. The Parthian general Surena, whose full name was Aaron Sparbod Surena, was a nobleman of high rank and great wealth. At just 30 years of age, he was already renowned for his charisma, cunning, and battlefield flair. His army was relatively small, perhaps 10,000 strong, but every man was a horseman, trained for mobility and endurance. Surena's force consisted of 2 arms, horse archers, light and fast, who carried composite bows made of wood, horn, and sinew, and cataphracts, the shock cavalry, armoured from head to toe along with their mounts, capable of thunderous charges that could smash through infantry lines. These were not foot soldiers to be pinned and flanked. They were a mobile storm. Crassus, meanwhile, advanced into the desert with his legions in close order, forming deep, tight lines better suited for urban sieges or forest battles than an open plain. He ignored the advice of local allies, including the Armenian king Artavasdes, who had urged Crassus to take a safer mountainous route through Armenia, where cavalry would be less effective. Instead, Crassus marched directly into the flatlands. When the 2 forces met near Carrhae, Surena employed a masterclass in psychological warfare and battlefield control. His horse archers began their attack with volleys of arrows, riding in wide arcs and keeping out of reach of Roman infantry. The composite bows they used had remarkable range and power, and their arrows rained down endlessly. Roman discipline held at first. The soldiers formed testudo, tortoise formations, with overlapping shields, but the arrows kept coming. Surena had planned for this. He brought with him hundreds of camels laden with spare arrows. His archers never had to retreat or reload from a distant base. Their supply was always close at hand. Crassus ordered a cavalry charge, led by his son Publius Licinius Crassus. The young man, brave and eager to prove himself, rode out with over 1,000 Gallic horsemen. Surena anticipated this. He feigned a retreat, a classic Parthian tactic, drawing Publius and his men far from the Roman main force. When they were isolated, the trap was sprung. Horse archers surrounded the Roman cavalry, cutting them down with arrows. Then came the cataphracts, charging in brutal waves. Publius fought bravely but was overwhelmed. In a final act of despair, he took his own life. Surena, never one to miss the psychological dimension of war, had Publius's head cut off and mounted on a spear. It was brought back and displayed to the Roman main force. The effect was devastating. Crassus was broken, emotionally and tactically. The Romans attempted to hold their ground through the long, suffocating day, but their water ran low. Their wounded cried out. The sun never seemed to set. That night, they attempted a retreat. Some units managed to escape toward Carrhae. Others were lost in the dark. Morale collapsed. Command broke down. Surena, ever the showman, offered Crassus a meeting the next day to negotiate. Desperate to save what remained of his men, Crassus agreed. The two parties met, but tensions flared. In the confusion, Crassus was seized and killed. Some accounts say he was executed immediately. Others suggest his death came in a scuffle. Roman sources, always fond of symbolic endings, claim molten gold was poured into his mouth, a cruel joke about his greed. The defeat was total. Of the 40,000 Roman soldiers who crossed the Euphrates, nearly 20,000 were killed. Another 10,000 were captured and would be settled deep within Parthian territory, far from home. Only a fraction made it back to Syria. Rome had suffered one of its greatest military disasters, on par with Cannae and the Teutoburg forest. The psychological shock rippled through the Republic. Crassus, the wealthiest man in Rome, was dead. His ambitions had died with him, and with them the uneasy balance of power in the first triumvirate. Parthia, for its part, did not press further into Roman lands. Surena, despite his brilliance, was executed the following year, likely out of jealousy from King Orodes. The Parthians preferred to enjoy their victory, rather than overextend. But a line had been crossed. For the first time, Rome had learned that its legions were not invincible, that beyond the deserts, past the rivers, lay an empire that could fight and win. Aftershocks and intrigues, 5344 BCE. The dust of Carrhae had not yet settled, and already the world began to shift. Rome, for all its power, had suffered a wound not just of numbers but of pride, and such wounds fester. News of Crassus's death spread slowly westward, carried on the backs of retreating soldiers and the uncertain words of diplomats. The Republic listened in disbelief. The mighty legions broken by Eastern horsemen. A Roman consul slaughtered in foreign sand. It would take time for the sting to wear off. For now, Rome turned inward, licking its wounds and bracing for what might follow. But Parthia was not yet poised to press its advantage. King Orodes II, secure in his throne after Surena's victory, nonetheless feared the general's rising popularity. And so, in a decision that historians still puzzle over, Orodes had Surena executed. Whether out of jealousy, fear of a coup, or a desire to show that no noble was beyond royal reach, Orodes removed the man who had delivered him one of the greatest victories in Parthian history. Thus, Parthia stood victorious, but uncertain. The Roman prisoners taken at Carrhae were marched east, not to chains or death, but to a curious fate. Some were resettled near the eastern frontiers of the Parthian Empire, in the region of Margiana, near modern-day Turkmenistan. There they are said to have lived for years, even decades, guarding Parthian borders against nomadic tribes. Legends, some fanciful, others more grounded, tell of Roman veterans founding villages, intermarrying, and even maintaining Roman military discipline deep in the east. Meanwhile, in Rome, the first triumvirate was unravelling. With Crassus dead, the uneasy alliance between Pompey and Julius Caesar grew strained. Caesar, campaigning successfully in Gaul, grew ever more popular. Pompey, wary of his rival's rise, aligned himself with the Senate's more conservative factions. As Rome hurtled towards civil war, the memory of Carrhae faded slightly, not forgotten, but set aside. For nearly a decade after the battle, direct conflict between Rome and Parthia paused. Both empires looked inward. Parthia, under Orodes, managed internal rebellions and court politics. Rome tore itself apart. In 49 BCE, Caesar crossed the Rubicon, triggering the civil war that would end the Roman Republic. Pompey fled east, gathering forces in Greece. The decisive moment came at Pharsalus in 48 BCE, where Caesar's smaller force defeated Pompey's grand army. Pompey fled again, this time to Egypt, where betrayal awaited him. He was murdered upon arrival. Back in Parthia, King Orodes watched these events with interest. He understood that chaos in Rome might offer opportunities, but he was cautious. The Parthians had learned that Roman strength, while fearsome, could be undermined by internal discord. Then came a turning point. Quintus Labienus, a Roman general once loyal to Pompey, fled to Parthia after Caesar's victories. There he found a warm reception. Orodes, perhaps sensing that Rome's wounds could still be exploited, welcomed Labienus and offered him command of Roman defectors and Parthian auxiliaries. It was an extraordinary situation, a Roman leading Parthian troops against other Romans, but it would not unfold fully until after Caesar's death. In 44 BCE, the Ides of March arrived. Julius Caesar, now dictator for life, was assassinated in the Senate by a group of conspirators who feared he would crown himself king. The world shook. Rome plunged once more into civil war. Mark Antony, Caesar's ally and friend, positioned himself as heir to power. And Octavian, Caesar's adopted son, began his own rise. But what mattered most for our story was that Rome was distracted again, and Parthia, watching carefully, prepared to move. The memory of Carrhae was not forgotten. It echoed still in the east. Roman honour, wounded but not yet avenged, would one day seek satisfaction. But not yet. First, the next act would unfold under the banner of Labienus, the Roman who would return with a Parthian army. Labienus and the return of the East, 44-38 BCE. It's the spring of 42 BCE, and a new wind is blowing across the eastern frontier of the Roman world. Julius Caesar is dead. The Senate is divided. The heirs to his power, Mark Antony and Octavian, are still struggling to tame the storm of succession, and into this moment of confusion and realignment, from the east rides a man once counted among Caesar's enemies. His name is Quintus Labienus. Labienus had been a loyal general under Pompey, a veteran of the civil wars. After Caesar's victory, rather than surrender, he fled east, not to hide, but to continue the fight. And in Parthia, he found both refuge and opportunity. Orodes II, always watching for Roman weakness, saw in Labienus a rare chance, a Roman face to lead a Parthian force back into Roman lands. So it was that Labienus, once a son of the Republic, now returned as an invader, with Parthian horsemen at his side. In 40 BCE, the Parthian army crossed the Euphrates. Their campaign was swift and stunning. Roman Syria collapsed in a matter of weeks. Town after town opened its gates, some in fear, others in quiet hope that perhaps this was a cleansing storm that would restore the old order. Labienus moved with confidence, capturing Apamea, Antioch, and much of southern Anatolia. The Roman garrisons, already undermanned and caught off guard, were overwhelmed. Simultaneously, Orodes' son, Pacorus, led another wing of the Parthian army south into Judea, supporting a revolt against Rome and installing Antigonus as king in Jerusalem. The Parthians now controlled not only Syria but large swaths of Asia Minor and the Levant. For a brief moment, the dream of a Roman-Parthian balance seemed to tilt heavily toward the east. But dreams, like armies, can be fragile. Back in Rome, the Eastern crisis demanded a response. Mark Antony, preoccupied with affairs in Egypt and political maneuvering in Rome, delegated the task to one of his most capable lieutenants, Publius Ventidius. Ventidius is one of those quiet heroes of Roman history. Born of humble origins, even rumoured to have once been a prisoner of war in his youth, he rose through the ranks by competence and caution. When handed command in the east, he did not rush. Instead he waited. The Parthians, emboldened by their rapid gains, had overextended. Their supply lines were thin, and their local support uncertain. Labienus split his forces, holding territories in Asia Minor, while Pacorus pressed deeper into Syria. Ventidius saw his chance. In 39 BCE he struck. His legions, well rested and well supplied, moved quickly. He first targeted Labienus, isolating and defeating him in pitched battle. Labienus was captured and executed shortly after, a Roman ending, for a Roman rebel. With the western wing of the invasion shattered, Ventidius turned to face Pacorus. The decisive moment came in 38 BCE at the Battle of Mount Ginderus. It was a mirror of Carrhae, but this time the mirror cracked in Rome's favour. Ventidius used the high ground, forcing the Parthian cavalry to charge uphill, breaking their momentum. When the cataphracts faltered, Roman legions counterattacked with brutal discipline. Pacorus, the son of Orodes, was killed in the fighting. The Parthian army retreated across the Euphrates. The invasion was over. Ventidius did not pursue. He understood the limits of Roman reach and resisted the temptation to strike deep into Parthian territory. Instead, he restored Roman control in Syria, reinforced the border, and quietly returned west, refusing the triumph he had earned. This cautious success marked a turning point. Rome had avenged Carrhae, at least in part. The Euphrates once again became the understood boundary. Orodes II, devastated by the loss of his son, fell into despair, and was soon murdered by another, his surviving son, Phraates IV. Thus, as the curtain fell on this act of the Long War, we see a moment of regained balance. The Parthians had tested Roman weakness and nearly reshaped the Eastern world. But from the ashes of civil war, Rome had answered. The memory of Labienus faded, and a new generation of leaders would shape the next phase. Antony's Eastern ambition, 38 to 33 BCE. The war had cooled, but the embers still glowed. After the Parthian invasion had been repelled, and Roman control reasserted over the Levant, a brief lull fell across the eastern frontier. It was not peace exactly, more a pause, a moment of uneasy breathing, and into this pause stepped Mark Antony, consul triumvir, and now de facto master of Rome's eastern provinces. Antony was no stranger to ambition. He had fought alongside Caesar in Gaul and stood at his side in the final moments before the Ides of March. Now, as part of the second triumvirate alongside Octavian and Lepidus, he held command over the east, and with it the opportunity to fulfill a dream that had haunted Roman generals since the time of Crassus, the conquest of Parthia. But Antony was not simply a soldier. He was also a politician, a lover, and a man drawn to spectacle. His court had drifted toward Alexandria and toward Cleopatra VII, Queen of Egypt, and one of the most brilliant political minds of the age. The alliance was both romantic and strategic. Together they imagined a Roman-Egyptian Eastern Empire, one that could rival the growing power of Octavian in the West. For this vision to succeed, Antony needed a great victory, and so, in 36 BCE, he launched his Parthian campaign. He began, like Crassus before him, with confidence, but unlike Crassus, Antony had learned from past mistakes, or so he believed. He negotiated an alliance with the king of Armenia, Artavasdes II, and gathered an enormous force, 16 legions, thousands of cavalry, siege engines, and supplies. His aim was to strike deep into Parthia, seizing the city of Phraspa in Media Atropatene and cutting the heart out of the eastern kingdom. The initial march was long and arduous. The terrain, as ever, was punishing. Vast plains, rocky uplands, and the slow erosion of morale under scorching skies. Still, the Roman army pressed on, but the Parthians were watching. Phraates IV, newly crowned after assassinating his father, was a ruthless and cunning ruler. He avoided pitched battle, relying instead on scorched-earth tactics and constant harassment. Parthian cavalry shadowed the Roman march, disrupting supply lines and attacking stragglers. Worse still, Antony's Armenian allies proved unreliable. Artavasdes II, sensing that the campaign was faltering, withdrew his support at a critical moment, leaving Antony isolated deep in hostile territory. At Phraspar, the siege began, and quickly unravelled. The city was strongly defended, and the Parthians, rather than rushing to relieve it, harassed the Roman rear. Antony's siege engines, transported with great effort, were destroyed in a surprise cavalry attack. For weeks the legions fought hunger, heat, and fatigue. When a Parthian peace envoy arrived offering terms, Antony refused, though privately he knew he must withdraw. The retreat was brutal. The Roman army, battered and undersupplied, turned back across the highlands. Parthian and Median forces followed relentlessly. Every step of the march was hounded. Antony, in a rare moment of humility, walked on foot among his men, sharing their sufferings. By the time they reached safety near Armenia, the army had lost over 20,000 men, more than half its number. It was not a complete disaster like Carrhae, but it was close. Another Roman dream of eastern conquest, broken against the unyielding plains. Antony returned to Alexandria, seeking solace and support from Cleopatra. He framed the campaign not as a defeat, but as a heroic struggle, a narrow escape against impossible odds. But the truth was clear. Rome had failed again to bring Parthia to heel. The Parthians, however, did not press the advantage. Phraates IV remained focused on internal challenges. His throne was not secure, and the wounds of the campaign, though less visible on the eastern side, had been real. And so, for the time being, the Euphrates remained the boundary. But in Rome, the war for power between Antony and Octavian was reaching its climax, and what had been an imperial rivalry in the east would soon feed into a civil reckoning at home. Augustus and the Art of Peace. 33-20 BCE. The swords of war had clashed long enough. Now came a man with a different weapon: patience. With Mark Antony's eastern dreams reduced to smoke and silence after his defeat at the Battle of Actium in 31 BCE, Octavian returned to Rome not merely as victor, but as master of the Republic. By 27 BCE, he would become Augustus, the first emperor in name if not in blunt title, and the architect of what history remembers as the Pax Romana. But peace, true peace, is never won by one side alone. And though Augustus held the west in his grasp, he turned next to the east, where the memory of Carrhae still lingered, and where the legions still dreamed of lost standards. Yes, the standards, the aquilae, silver eagles of Roman might, carried into the desert by Crassus in 53 BCE and captured by the Parthians in victory. For decades they had remained trophies, symbols of Roman failure and Parthian pride. Augustus wanted them back, but he would not raise an army. Unlike Crassus or Antony, Augustus understood that military conquest was not the only way to secure power. The empire needed rest, and the treasury, strained from years of civil war, needed time to refill. So Augustus pursued a quieter path, that of negotiation, ceremony, and the careful cultivation of prestige. The Parthian throne at this time was still held by Phraates IV, a king both feared and distrusted. His rise through patricide had left scars, and his rule was marred by plots and rival claimants. Among these claimants was a son of his, Phraates, and even members of the broader Sassanid royal family who had fled to Roman protection. Augustus saw leverage in these exiles. Instead of swords, he offered diplomacy and implied threats. Around 23 BCE, envoys travelled back and forth across the Euphrates. Rome, for all its patience, made it known that if Parthia did not return the standards, they would recognize rival claimants to the Parthian throne. Phraates, wary of Roman interference and increasingly unpopular at home, saw wisdom in compromise. In 20 BCE, a formal meeting took place on a bridge over the Euphrates, a carefully neutral ground. There, amid banners and watchful soldiers, a remarkable exchange occurred. The the Parthians returned the lost standards of Carrhae, not as spoils recaptured in battle, but as diplomatic tribute. The moment was choreographed to perfection. Augustus had a monument erected in Rome, the Temple of Mars Altar, Mars the Avenger, to celebrate the return. Statues depicted the Parthian handing over the eagle to a Roman officer. Coins were minted, poets were commissioned. The entire empire was told, in polished prose and marble relief, that Rome had triumphed not just in war but in honour. The truth was more complex. Rome had not conquered Parthia. It had not planted its standards in Ctesiphon or marched victorious through Mesopotamia, but it had turned a humiliating defeat into a symbol of patient strength, a lesson in optics as much as empire. For the Parthians, the deal was a way to buy time. Phraates IV, ever wary, also requested a Roman gift, not gold, but something more personal. He asked Augustus to send him a Roman slave girl, gifted as part of a diplomatic exchange. Her name was Musa. Beautiful, clever, and eventually incredibly powerful, Musa would rise to become Queen of Parthia, mother to a future king, and one of the most intriguing figures in Parthian history. But her tale, like the standards she travelled east to witness, is one for the chapters ahead. For now, Augustus had secured what Crassus and Antony could not, Roman dignity in the east without the price of war. Musa and the Quiet Empire, 24 BCE. While Augustus celebrated the return of Rome's lost standards in marble and myth, far to the east, the woman gifted as part of that same diplomacy was already reshaping the Parthian world. Her name was Musa. To the Romans, she had been little more than a gesture, a beautiful Italian woman, likely educated, sent to the Parthian court as a concubine. But Musa was no passive prize. In the halls of Ctesiphon, amid the silk hangings and ziggurat shadows, she began to exert quiet influence. Phraates IV, aging and increasingly paranoid, grew to trust her counsel, and in time she bore him a son, Phraates. This child, half Roman by blood, became the centre of Musa's ambitions. Within a few short years, Musa had done the unthinkable. She persuaded Phraates to send his other sons, rivals to her son's future, to Rome as hostages. It was a brilliant move cloaked in diplomacy. To Augustus, it appeared as a gesture of goodwill. To Parthian nobles, it seemed to be the king securing peace. But in truth, it was Musa eliminating competition. By the turn of the millennium, Musa was not merely queen, she was co-ruler. In 2 BCE, Phraates IV disappeared from the record, most likely poisoned. Musa and her son ascended the throne as co-monarchs, an astonishing precedent in Parthian tradition. Coins were struck with both their images side by side. Musa became the only Roman woman to ever rule over the Parthian Empire. Her rule, though brief, brought stability. She understood court politics, and she kept Roman ambitions in check through continued diplomacy. Though no battles were fought during her tenure, her presence alone marked one of the most unusual and telling chapters in the long story of Rome and Parthia. But power, once gained, is always contested. Phraates, now Phraates V, sought to strengthen his hold. Rumours, perhaps stirred by enemies or Roman agents, accused him and Musa of incest. Whether true or slander, the whisper of taboo undermined their legitimacy. Parthian nobles, never easy to control, began to turn against them. By 4 CE, both Musa and her son were overthrown in a coup led by Aurelius III, a distant relative from the royal house. Their reign was erased as an anomaly, and yet it left a lasting impression. Rome had not conquered Parthia, but through Musa it had once ruled it. In Rome, Augustus, now an aging emperor, watched with caution. The eastern frontier had held for decades without open war, but instability in Parthia was never good news. A strong Parthian king meant order. A weak one invited chaos, and with it, temptation. Thus, as the 1st century drew on, Rome began quietly preparing again. New generals were posted to Syria. Forts were reinforced. The Euphrates crossings were monitored more closely than ever. The peace secured by Augustus through diplomacy would soon be tested, not by Parthian ambition, but by Roman impatience. And on the horizon, a name began to stir in the ranks of Roman command, a name that would come to define the next great encounter, Germanicus. The shadow of Germanicus, 419 CE. The reign of Augustus was entering its twilight. Rome stood tall, cloaked in marble and order, but along its vast frontiers the quiet murmur of discontent stirred, and nowhere more so than in the east. Parthia, shaken by the fall of Musa and her son, was once again a land of uncertainty. Kings rose and fell with alarming speed. Orodes III, who had ousted the Roman-born co-monarchs, lasted barely 4 years before he too was overthrown. In his place came Vonones Thor, a curious figure, educated in Rome, fluent in its customs, and utterly unsuited for the throne he inherited. Vonones was one of the Parthian princes sent to Rome years earlier as a diplomatic pawn. He had grown up among senators, philosophers, and Latin-speaking nobles. When Parthia's nobility summoned him back as a compromise king in 8 CE, they quickly realized their mistake. He dressed like a Roman. He spoke like a Roman. He governed like one too, favoring bureaucracy over tradition, central authority over noble privilege. The Parthian aristocracy, proud and tribal, recoiled. By 12 CE, a rebellion forced Vonones to flee eastward, seeking refuge in Armenia, that perennial buffer zone between empires. There, he was crowned king again, but now under Roman protection. The move was deliberate and provocative. For the Romans, installing Vonones in Armenia was a way to maintain influence without direct confrontation. But Parthia saw it differently. Artabanus II, a rival claimant to the Parthian throne, now ascended in Ctesiphon. Unlike Vonones, Artabanus was born and raised among the Parthian elite. He was a warrior king, respected by the nobles and deeply suspicious of Rome. The Euphrates began to tremble again. Into this fragile balance stepped Germanicus, a young general, the adopted son of Emperor Tiberius, and a man of immense promise. Beloved by the army and the people, Germanicus was dispatched east in 18 CE, not as a conqueror, but as a stabilizer. His mission was delicate: reaffirm Rome's authority in Armenia, soothe tensions with Parthia, and prevent another war. Germanicus travelled with flair. Wherever he went, from Antioch to the coast of Phoenicia, he was met with cheers and ceremony. His presence alone seemed to calm unrest. In Armenia, he managed a peaceful transition of power, removing Vonones with dignity and installing a local noble as king with both Roman and Parthian consent. It was a masterclass in soft power. Germanicus also met with Artabanus II. The two men, each wary of the other, agreed to uphold the Euphrates as the border. A symbolic exchange of gifts followed, and for a time the frontier quieted. And yet, not all was well. In 19 CE, Germanicus died suddenly in Antioch. The cause remains mysterious: illness, poison, or palace intrigue. Whispers spread that his death had not been natural. Some blamed Tiberius, fearing the young general's popularity. Others blamed local agents of Parthia, eager to see Roman diplomacy stumble. Whatever the truth, Germanicus was gone. His death marked the end of an era, a brief window in which peace was crafted, not through force, but presence. Rome would spend the next years reflecting on his legacy, while Parthia, now steadied under Artabanus II, turned inward to rebuild its own strength. The Eastern question, who should dominate the borderlands, who should sway the kings of Armenia, who would control the trade that flowed through Mesopotamia, was not answered. It was simply deferred. Caligula, Claudius, and the silence on the Euphrates, 1954 CE. After the death of Germanicus, the eastern frontier fell into a strange quiet, like a field after a storm, not peaceful, but hushed, watchful. Rome turned inward once again. The Emperor Tiberius, brooding and suspicious, chose not to escalate affairs in the east. He distrusted nearly everyone, and without Germanicus to act as his eyes and voice, he preferred caution. Armenia, always the pressure point between Rome and Parthia, remained in fragile balance under a Roman-approved king. In Parthia, Artabanus II faced his own problems. The noble families, powerful and jealous of any centralizing force, pushed back against his authority. Revolts simmered in Media, in Elymais, and in the desert fringes. Though Artabanus attempted to expand his influence westward, his reach remained limited. The Euphrates held steady. In 37 CE, the Roman world shifted. Tiberius died, or was smothered, some say, and the young Gaius, known to history as Caligula, became emperor. Caligula's rule was a spectacle of contradictions. At first, he was welcomed as the son of Germanicus, the darling of the army, the golden-haired prince of the people, but soon his reign descended into chaos. Strange decrees, violent purges, bizarre behaviour. He declared himself a god. He marched his troops to the shores of Gaul and ordered them to collect seashells as trophies of war. In the east, this instability caused concern. But Caligula, for all his madness, took little interest in the Parthian question. He appointed new governors to Syria and Judea, some competent, others less so. Yet despite the chance for Parthia to act during Rome's disorder, no great war erupted. Perhaps Artabanus remembered Carrhae, not as a triumph, but as a warning. Or perhaps both empires, battered by internal pressures, had little appetite for another drawn-out conflict. In 41 CE, Caligula was assassinated by his own guards. In his place rose Claudius, the stammering, scholarly uncle, underestimated by all. Where Caligula had raged, Claudius ruled with care. He expanded the empire westward, conquering Britain, and restored a measure of bureaucratic competence. In the east, Claudius continued a policy of diplomatic caution. When Armenia once again became unstable, as it so often did, he supported local rulers aligned with Roman interests, but avoided large-scale intervention. Parthia, under Vardans III and later Gotazes II, was consumed by its own dynastic infighting. Brothers turned on brothers, satraps declared semi-independence, and the capital at Ctesiphon saw one claimant after another. The Euphrates, that ancient line of tension, remained unbroken, and yet there was no true peace, only a lull, a long inhalation before the next breath. In these decades, something subtle changed. Trade flourished along the Silk Road. Roman merchants brought glassware, wine and cloth. Parthian caravans carried spices, gems and silk. Palmyra, the desert oasis city, grew wealthy as a middleman. Soldiers still manned the frontier forts. Diplomats still watched the flow of Armenian politics with narrow eyes. But for a time, the clash of steel gave way to the rustle of papyrus, the chime of coins, the quiet murmur of merchants haggling in markets where Latin and Parthian were spoken side by side. Next, the drama will rise again. A new emperor will take the throne in Rome, one who sees glory in arms, not in trade. His name, Nero, and his generals will not sit quietly on the border. Nero and the war for Armenia, 54-66. CE. When Claudius died in 54 CE, likely poisoned by his wife Agrippina, the imperial throne passed to her son, the 17-year-old Nero. At first, Rome was cautiously optimistic. Nero was young, artistic, and surrounded by competent advisors. But as his reign matured, the darker tones emerged. Nero loved theatre more than governance, poetry more than policy. His rule would become synonymous with excess and cruelty, yet in his early years it was not his vices that would trouble the East. It was his ambition. Armenia, again, became the fuse. In the late 50s, a new king was placed on the Armenian throne, Tiridates, brother of the Parthian king Vologases there. This move, though subtle, was seismic. To Parthia it was a natural extension of familial alliance, but to Rome it was a challenge. Armenia had long been the buffer, the shared child of two empires. To see it drift under Parthian control was to see the balance falter. Nero, craving prestige, demanded response. In 58 CE, Gnaeus Domitius Corbulo, one of Rome's most capable generals, was dispatched east with orders to restore Roman authority. Corbulo was experienced, cautious, and deeply respected by his troops. He began not with rash charges, but with discipline. He retrained the eastern legions. He built fortresses and roads. He stabilized Syria, and only then did he move. In 58 and 59, Corbulo led a well-prepared campaign into Armenia. He defeated the forces of Tiridates, captured key strongholds, and took the Armenian capital, Artasata. The city was burned, its defenders scattered. A new pro-Roman king, Tigranes VI, was installed. Corbulo, ever pragmatic, avoided excessive brutality. He understood that occupation alone was not victory. Back in Rome, Nero celebrated with festivals and garlands. Statues were raised, coins were minted, the empire had triumphed. But Parthia was not finished. Vologases B, though initially constrained by internal revolts, now responded. In 61 CE, Parthian forces re-entered Armenia and expelled Tigranes VI. The fragile peace collapsed. A new commander, Lucius Gesenius Paetus, was sent by Nero to hold the gains, but Paetus was no Corbulo. Brash, arrogant, and unfamiliar with eastern terrain, Paetus marched unprepared into Armenia. In 62 CE at Rhandaea, his legions were surrounded by Parthian and Armenian forces. Supplies dwindled, morale broke. Paetus, in humiliation, surrendered. Corbulo, still commanding in Syria, was called upon once more. With calm precision, he led a new force to the Euphrates. His mere presence, and the reputation that followed, forced the Parthians to negotiate. The result was a compromise. Tiridates would be king of Armenia, but only if he received his crown from Nero himself in Rome. It was a clever arrangement. Rome retained symbolic supremacy. Parthia maintained dynastic influence. In 66 CE, the most unusual moment of this long conflict unfolded. Tiridates, draped in eastern silks and accompanied by nobles and priests, travelled to Rome. He was greeted not as a defeated enemy, but as an honoured guest. Nero received him in the Forum. There, in a display of power and ceremony, Tiridates knelt and was crowned by the emperor. Rome had, once again, turned war into theatre. Nero claimed victory. The eastern provinces breathed easier, and for a time the Euphrates held. Yet underneath it all, the pressures remained. Parthia had not been broken, only balanced. Rome had not conquered, only negotiated. The year of the four emperors and eastern reverberations, 66 to 70 CE. In 66 CE, as Tiridates of Armenia bowed before Nero in Rome's Forum, it seemed, for a brief ceremonial moment, that the balance of the East had been restored. But ceremonies, however splendid, could not still the deeper tides of empire. Only 2 years later, Nero would be dead, a suicide in a suburban villa, hunted by the Senate and forsaken by his guards. His fall plunged the Roman world into chaos, unleashing one of the most violent and unstable years in its long history, the year of the four emperors, Galba, Otho, Vitellius, and finally Vespasian. Each rose and fell in rapid succession, some by assassination, others by civil war. The legions, long the spine of Roman authority, turned against one another, declaring their own generals emperor. The empire fractured, and the cracks reached all the way to the eastern frontier. Vespasian, the final victor, had been stationed in Judea, suppressing a Jewish revolt that had erupted in 66 CE. His campaign had begun as a regional crackdown, but as Rome collapsed into civil strife, Vespasian's ambitions broadened. By 69 CE, his eastern legions declared him emperor. With the support of the Syrian and Egyptian provinces and the quiet approval of Eastern Roman allies, he marched on Rome. But while Rome burned with intrigue, Parthia watched. Vologases I remained king in Ctesiphon. The crown passed without war, and for now the Parthians made no move. Perhaps they remembered Corbulo's campaigns. Perhaps they saw no gain in stirring an exhausted rival. Or perhaps, like many, they waited to see which Roman would emerge. Armenia remained in Tiridates' hands. The crown he had accepted from Nero still glinted, but now its power was more symbolic than practical. The Armenian highlands, rugged and remote, became a kind of neutral zone again. Neither Rome nor Parthia dared disturb it while their own houses shook. Yet the eastern provinces did not rest. Judea burned. The Jewish war, begun under Nero and continued under Vespasian's command, now passed to his son Titus. Cities were razed, the countryside was scarred, and in 70 CE Jerusalem fell. The temple, ancient and sacred, was destroyed, refugees scattered. The eastern Mediterranean shuddered. Trade routes were choked with soldiers. Caravans detoured or halted altogether. The Euphrates forts were reinforced but lightly manned, as Rome poured troops westward to settle its own affairs. Parthian agents watched the shifting lines, gauging strength. But Vespasian, once secure in Rome, turned swiftly to reassert control. He confirmed eastern governors, rewarded loyal generals, and made it clear that the frontiers would not be surrendered. He sent gifts to Armenia. He sent envoys to Parthia. The message was clear: the empire might stagger, but it would not fall. And so, as the 70s dawned, Rome stood, bloodied, bruised, but breathing. Parthia, meanwhile, turned inward. Succession disputes loomed. Vologases' later years were marked by the same noble tensions that had plagued his predecessors. The eastern frontier, still smouldering, remained quiet, for now. Vespasian's east and the Parthian calm, 7096 CE. In the years following the destruction of Jerusalem and the triumphal arches of Vespasian's victory, the Roman Empire sought stability. Its new Flavian dynasty, forged in fire and crowned in compromise, now turned from civil war to consolidation, and across the Euphrates, Parthia watched and waited. Vespasian had come to power with the support of the eastern legions. Syria, Egypt, and Judea had been his base, and he did not forget it. He restructured the command of the eastern provinces, placed loyal governors in key positions, and ensured that the vital frontier fortresses were strengthened and provisioned. But he also understood the cost of overextension. Unlike Nero, Vespasian was not drawn to theatrical war. His victories were real, hard-won, and usually defensive. He preferred diplomacy when it worked and firmness when it failed. The Parthian king at this time, Vologases I, remained cautious. Though his reign had seen moments of ambition, including the Armenian intervention earlier under Nero, the scars of those struggles lingered. Parthia too needed to consolidate. The 70s and 80s CE were thus marked by a kind of watchful peace. Armenia remained the barometer. Tiridates, now older, still ruled from his mountain capital. He maintained ties with both empires, a balancing act that preserved the calm. Trade caravans moved east and west. Silk from China, ivory from India, frankincense from Arabia, all flowed along the arteries of empire, passing through Palmyra, Edessa, and Ctesiphon. Vespasian encouraged this commerce. Taxes on eastern goods filled Rome's coffers. The empire, rebuilding from fire and rebellion, needed wealth more than conquest. And Parthia, riven by dynastic tensions just beneath the surface, had no appetite for open war. But the stillness was deceptive. In Rome, Vespasian died in 79 CE and was succeeded by his son Titus, the general who had crushed Jerusalem. Titus reigned briefly, his rule marked by disasters more than wars, a great fire in Rome, a plague, and most notably the eruption of Mount Vesuvius in 79 CE, which buried Pompey and Herculaneum. Titus, beloved but unlucky, died in 81 CE. In his place came his brother, Domitian, a ruler both ambitious and severe. Domitian believed in military glory, though his greatest campaigns were in Dacia and along the Rhine. In the east, he maintained the fortified lines, but increased surveillance along the Euphrates. The flow of envoys between Rome and Ctesiphon continued, but always with an undertone of unease. In Parthia, the crown passed to Vologases II, and soon after to Pacorus II, both rulers navigating the ever-fractious noble houses and rising local satraps. Their grip on the eastern reaches of the empire, particularly in Seistan and Bactria, was tenuous. Still, there was no full rupture. It was an era of fort-building and road-laying, of diplomatic gifts and mutual suspicion. Roman soldiers patrolled the limes. Parthian horsemen guarded the mountain passes. Neither side wished to strike first, but neither let down their guard. By 96 CE, Domitian was assassinated, ending the Flavian line. His death opened the door to a new kind of rule, the age of the so-called five good emperors beginning with Nerva. And on the horizon, a new kind of Roman leadership was taking shape, pragmatic, philosophical, but still aware that peace, while welcome, was always temporary. Trajan's gamble, 96-117 CE. With the assassination of Domitian in 96 CE, a new chapter began, one often remembered as Rome's golden age. It was the era of the five good emperors, and the first of them, Nerva, ruled briefly before passing the mantle to his chosen successor, Trajan. Trajan was a soldier's emperor. Born in Hispania and seasoned on the Rhine, he brought discipline, pragmatism, and ambition. He expanded the empire's frontiers, conquered Dacia, and rebuilt Rome's infrastructure with precision. But in his later years, his eyes turned east, toward Parthia. The reasons were complex. Parthia, under the rule of Osroes I, had recently meddled in Armenia, installing an unapproved king without Roman consultation. To Trajan, it was more than an insult, it was a provocation. The balance that had held for decades had been disturbed. In 113 CE, Trajan crossed the Euphrates. At first he did not declare war. Instead he moved slowly, reinforcing Roman presence in Armenia and pressing claims that Rome must approve any new Armenian king. But Parthian resistance grew. Osroes rejected Roman demands. And so, in 114 CE, Trajan launched a full invasion. The campaign began with rapid success. Roman legions, well supplied and commanded by seasoned officers, swept through Armenia. The pro-Parthian king was deposed, and a Roman governor installed. From there, Trajan moved south into Mesopotamia, following the great rivers that watered the Fertile Crescent. City after city opened its gates: Nisibis, Edessa, Dura Europos. The Tigris was crossed. Babylon, long a symbol of ancient grandeur, was occupied. By 116 CE, Trajan had reached Ctesiphon itself, the Parthian capital. Rome had achieved the unthinkable. Trajan even went further. He sent a fleet down the Tigris and reached the Persian Gulf. From there, he looked toward India, or at least toward the legends of Alexander. But he was no longer a young man. His health faltered, and worse, the provinces behind him began to burn. The Parthians, though defeated in battle, were not destroyed. Their armies regrouped. Local uprisings flared. Jewish communities in Mesopotamia and Egypt, feeling pressure from all sides, rose in revolt. Roman supply lines thinned. Garrisons were isolated. Trajan, once so certain of his conquest, now faced a harsh truth. The East could be taken, but not held. In early 117 CE, weakened by illness and age, Trajan began the journey back to Rome, but he would never return. He died that summer in Cilicia. His ashes were sent back and placed beneath his great column in Rome. And with his death, the eastern conquests began to unravel. His adopted son and successor, Hadrian, immediately ordered a withdrawal. The new emperor saw what Trajan could not admit, that glory without permanence was a costly mirage. Rome pulled back to the Euphrates. Armenia was once again made a client state. Mesopotamia was abandoned. Parthia, bruised but breathing, reclaimed its lands. And so the tide receded. But something had shifted. For the first time, a Roman army had marched into the heart of Parthia, had taken its capital, had tasted the edge of its empire. The dream of Eastern conquest had not died. It had merely been delayed. The watchful peace of Hadrian and Antoninus Pius, 117 or 161 CE. The death of Trajan in 117 CE brought an abrupt end to Rome's most audacious Eastern gamble. His successor, Hadrian, understood what Trajan had not, that empires, like bodies, can be stretched too far. Hadrian, tall and bearded, was both a soldier and a philosopher. Where Trajan had pushed outward, Hadrian drew inward. His first acts as emperor were to abandon the newly conquered territories in Mesopotamia and eastern Armenia. Roman garrisons pulled back behind the Euphrates. The brief dream of a Roman Parthia dissolved into the desert heat. Some called it cowardice, others saw wisdom. Hadrian chose stability over spectacle. He reinforced the eastern legions, rebuilt frontier forts, and emphasized negotiation. In Armenia, he allowed a local ruler, acceptable to both Rome and Parthia, to take the throne. And with Parthia, he sent gifts, letters, and respectful envoys. The Parthians, under King Vologases III, responded in kind. The trauma of Trajan's invasion had not yet healed, and the Parthian court knew the cost of conflict. Their energies were focused eastward, toward rebellious provinces in Media and internal noble disputes. Thus began a period of what some historians call the watchful peace. Between 117 and 161 CE, Rome and Parthia did not meet in open battle. But this was no golden age, only a balance of unease, a quiet guardedness along the rivers and mountain passes. Hadrian's policy of non-expansion gave both empires breathing room. Trade resumed. Caravans laden with silks, gems, and spices moved between cities like Palmyra, Seleucia, and Antioch. Diplomatic missions were exchanged. Border incidents were resolved not with legions, but with letters. Hadrian's eastern tours were careful affairs. He visited the provinces, reviewed troops, and reaffirmed Roman presence without provocation. In Antioch, he was received with ceremony. In Egypt, he gazed at the pyramids and built temples to blend Roman and local customs. After Hadrian's death in 138 CE, his chosen heir, Antoninus Pius, continued the cautious path. Antoninus rarely left Italy. His rule was quiet, efficient, and deeply administrative. To the eastern provinces, he sent governors with clear instructions: preserve peace, defend the frontier, and avoid entanglements. In Parthia, Vologases III died in 147 CE, succeeded by Vologases IV. Though internal strife still simmered in the east, Parthia respected the status quo. The Euphrates was the line, and both sides, though wary, upheld it. This stretch of nearly 5 decades, from Hadrian to the end of Antoninus Pius's reign, stands out as one of the rare periods in the Roman Parthian saga where swords were sheathed. But even peace over time can become brittle. In the west, Rome's strength seemed unshaken, but in the east, whispers grew. Parthia's new king, Vologases IV, was bolder than his predecessors. And in Rome, Antoninus's heir was a different kind of man, a philosopher-warrior named Marcus Aurelius. Storm clouds were gathering beyond the Zagros Mountains. Marcus Aurelius and the Eastern War, 161–166 CE. When Antoninus Pius died in 161 CE, the empire passed to his adopted son, Marcus Aurelius. Though best remembered today as a Stoic philosopher, a thinker of deep reflections and quiet discipline, Marcus would find himself drawn into the chaos of war almost from the moment he donned the imperial purple. And not alone. He shared the throne, at least in name, with Lucius Verus, a man of contrasting temperament. Where Marcus was serious and cerebral, Verus was affable, indulgent, and fond of games. But it was Verus who would first lead the Roman response to a renewed threat from the east. Parthia had risen. Vologases IV, emboldened by Rome's long peace and sensing an opportunity, struck Armenia. The Parthians ousted the Roman client king and replaced him with their own candidate. Then, in swift succession, they pushed into Syria. Roman forts fell. Panic spread across the eastern provinces. The watchful peace was broken. In 162 CE, Marcus dispatched Lucius Verus east with a massive army, though it was Marcus in Rome who coordinated supplies, finance, and political cohesion. Verus, travelling with a retinue of advisors and generals, made Antioch his base. From there, Rome began its counter-offensive. The campaign was hard and slow. The legions were rusty after decades of calm. The terrain was difficult. And then came plague. As the army moved through the east, disease spread with it. a virulent strain that devastated both troops and civilians. The Antonine Plague, as it came to be known, would haunt the empire for years. But still, Rome pressed forward. By 163 CE, Armenia was retaken. A new Roman-friendly king was crowned at Artaxata. Statues of Verus were raised, and Roman pride was rekindled. Then came the true test, the invasion of Mesopotamia. Between 164 and 166 CE, Roman generals Avidius Cassius and Martius Verus led coordinated strikes down the Euphrates and Tigris. Cities that had once defied Trajan now fell in succession. Seleucia was captured. Ctesiphon, the Parthian capital, was taken and partially burned. But, as before, the conquest could not be held. The armies, weakened by plague and stretched thin, could not maintain control deep within enemy territory. The Parthians, retreating into the Zagros mountains, licked their wounds and plotted their return. Rome withdrew, but on its own terms. Lucius Verus returned to Rome in triumph in 166 CE, hailed as a conquering hero. He celebrated with games, feasts, and golden statuary. But Marcus knew the truth. The war had been won, yes, but at a heavy cost. The plague spread westward, emptying towns, draining the treasury, and haunting his later reign. Parthia, humiliated but not broken, nursed its grudges. The border once more became tense and watched. The cycle had resumed. Cracks in the east. The decline of Parthia and the rise of Septimius Severus, 198 CE. As the Antonine Plague coursed through the veins of empire, it left more than sickness in its wake. The Roman East, while momentarily victorious, began to strain under the weight of overstretched supply lines, wounded provinces, and growing unrest. Yet it was in Parthia that the deeper fracture lines would begin to widen. Vologases IV, the Parthian king who had challenged Marcus Aurelius, died in 191 CE. He left a realm weary from war, riven with noble rivalries and economic fatigue. His successor, Vologases V, struggled to hold the empire together. In the west, Rome watched and waited. The Emperor Marcus Aurelius died in 180 CE. His son, Commodus, inherited the throne. But Commodus, unlike his father, had little interest in frontier policy. His rule was marked by spectacle and vanity. And while the eastern frontier remained quiet on the surface, both empires were beginning to fray at the edges. Parthia, more so than Rome, suffered from internal division. Its vast expanse from the Euphrates to the Oxus was never easily ruled. Kings depended on the loyalty of powerful noble houses, each commanding their own militias and fortresses. As central authority weakened, rebellion loomed. It came in the form of Pescennius Niger. After Commodus was assassinated in 192 CE, a brief but brutal civil war tore through Rome. 3 men vied for power: Didius Julianus in Rome, Pescennius Niger in Syria, and Septimius Severus along the Danube. Niger had the support of the eastern provinces, Egypt, Syria, and parts of Asia. His position was strong, and for a time it seemed Parthia might use the opportunity to reclaim lost ground. But Severus moved swiftly. By 194 CE, Severus had defeated Niger in battle and secured control of the eastern provinces. Now, with the east under Roman command, Severus turned his gaze across the Euphrates. Parthia had supported Niger, indirectly but clearly. This, in Severus's eyes, was cause for war. In 195 CE, Roman forces invaded Mesopotamia. Severus, commanding in person, followed the path of Trajan. The legions advanced through Adiabene, crossed the Tigris, and laid siege to cities once thought beyond Roman reach. Nisibis was secured. Seleucia fell. And by 198 CE, the Parthian capital, Ctesiphon, once again lay under Roman assault. This time, it yielded. Ctesiphon was taken, sacked, and stripped of its treasures. Severus, unlike Trajan, made no pretense of permanent occupation. He knew the land could not be held. Instead, he claimed symbolic victory, took thousands of prisoners, and redrew the map. Rome annexed parts of northern Mesopotamia, including the strategic city of Nisibis, and made it a permanent military zone. A new province was declared. Border fortresses were expanded. The Euphrates was no longer the edge. Now, Rome leaned deeper into the land between the rivers. Parthia, meanwhile, staggered. Its nobility bickered, its armies weakened, and in a few short decades it would fall, not to Rome, but to something new rising within its own borders. The fall of Parthia and the rise of the Sasanians, 198, 224 CE. As the 2nd century neared its end, the ancient power of Parthia teetered. Though the Sassanid kings still held court at Ctesiphon, their grip on the empire was fading. The sack of their capital by Septimius Severus in 198 CE had left a deep scar, and in the wake of that humiliation, the cracks spread faster. The nobility, always a force unto themselves in Parthian politics, grew restless. In the eastern provinces, especially in Persis, the rugged region near modern Fars, murmurs of independence stirred. The local governor there, a man named Ardashir, was gathering strength. At first, few noticed. Ardashir was one among many satraps, loyal in name but ambitious in reality. But unlike others, he had lineage, claiming descent from the ancient Achaemenids, and vision. He united the fractious highland tribes, secured alliances through both marriage and battle, and slowly expanded his power. Meanwhile, Rome turned inward again. Septimius Severus died in 211 CE, leaving the empire to his sons, Caracalla and Geta. The brothers detested each other. Within a year, Caracalla had Geta murdered and ruled alone. A cruel and volatile figure, Caracalla turned his gaze eastward once more, seeking to emulate Alexander. In 216 CE, he launched a fresh invasion of Parthia. The campaign began as so many did, with boasts and gold. Caracalla sent envoys to Parthia, demanding marriage to the daughter of King Artabanus IV. The offer was a farce. When the Parthians rejected it, Caracalla attacked, sacking towns and ravaging the countryside. But he never reached Ctesiphon. His gains were shallow, and by 217 CE he was dead, assassinated by his own men. Rome and Parthia signed peace once again, but Parthia was out of time. In 224 CE, Ardashir marched on Artabanus IV. The two armies met near Hormozgan, in the dry plains south of the Zagros Mountains. Artabanus fell in battle. The Arsacid line, nearly 5 centuries old, came to an end. A new power rose from the dust, the Sasanian Empire. Where Parthia had been a feudal patchwork, the Sasanians would forge a centralized, ideologically driven state. Their kings styled themselves as kings of kings, heirs not just of Parthia, but of ancient Persia. Fire temples were restored. Zoroastrianism became the state religion, and in their capital of Ctesiphon, once taken by Roman fire, they prepared to challenge Rome anew. The stage was set for a new kind of conflict, one colder, sharper, and more enduring. The tapestry was tightening. Twilight of an era, the last war of the first 250 years, 224-244 CE. With the fall of Parthia and the rise of the Sasanian Empire, the ancient dance between Rome and Persia entered a new phase. The names had changed, but the game had not. Two empires, Rome in the west, Persia in the east, still watched each other from across the Euphrates, still dreamt of conquest, and still feared the price of failure. Ardashir III, founder of the Sasanian dynasty, wasted no time. By 230 CE, he had consolidated power in the Iranian plateau and launched raids deep into Roman Mesopotamia. His goal was clear: restore the ancient boundaries of the Achaemenid Empire and sweep Rome from Asia. The Euphrates, once the line of peace, was now a corridor of war. Rome, under the aging Severan emperors, responded cautiously. Severus Alexander, young and untested, assumed the purple in 222 CE. For a decade, he tried diplomacy, sending envoys, making offers. Ardashir ignored them. He wanted no compromise. In 232 CE, Severus Alexander marched east. With 3 separate columns, he crossed into Sasanian-held territory. but the coordination failed. One column was destroyed, another stalled. The third, under the emperor himself, made limited gains but no lasting impact. The campaign ended in stalemate, and Alexander withdrew. Though hailed as a victor in Rome, it was clear the Sasanians were no fading force. They were organized, ambitious, and driven by ideology. Where the Parthians had ruled through noble consensus, the Sasanians ruled with central command. A quiet interlude followed, but not for long. In 238 CE, a young Sasanian prince named Shapur began to rise. When Ardashir died around 242 CE, Shapur I took the throne. Brilliant, bold, and aggressive, he prepared for a new offensive. Rome, by now, was crumbling. The crisis of the 3rd century had begun. Emperors came and went in quick succession. In 244 CE, the Emperor Gordian III, barely 20 years old, led a final great push eastward. At first, he found success. Roman forces won several battles near the Euphrates and advanced into Mesopotamia. But then, disaster struck. At the Battle of Mesech, deep in Sasanian territory, Gordian's army was ambushed. The young emperor was either slain in battle or murdered soon after by his successor, Philip the Arab. Rome signed a hasty peace and withdrew. Shapur claimed triumph. On the great rock reliefs at Nakshi Rustam, he had himself carved, towering over, Roman captives, declaring the dawn of a new age. The first 250 years of the Roman-Persian wars had ended. What began with shadowy skirmishes across Armenia had become a cycle of grand campaigns, brutal sieges, and shifting alliances. And though the empires had changed, Rome becoming more fragile, Persia reborn as Sasanian, the conflict endured. It would rage on for 4 more centuries, reshaping the destiny of East and West alike. Embers in the East, 250–260 CE. By the mid-3rd century, the Roman Empire was deep in crisis. A string of short-lived emperors, economic chaos, plagues, and barbarian incursions at every border had left the once mighty realm brittle. To the east, the Sasanian Empire, newly confident and ideologically driven, watched with growing intent. Shapur I, the second Sasanian monarch, had inherited a powerful, organized state from his father, Ardashir. But unlike the Parthians of old, the Sasanians had no interest in coexistence. They viewed themselves as the true heirs of Persia, and they sought to reclaim all lands once held by Darius and Xerxes. That meant Rome had no rightful place in Mesopotamia, Armenia, or Syria. As the Roman world faltered, Shapur struck. His first campaigns began in the late 240s, but by 250 CE he pushed west with renewed aggression. Cities along the frontier fell swiftly. Carrhae, scene of Crassus's old defeat, was taken. Nisibis, the Roman bulwark in Mesopotamia, was besieged. The Roman general Timesitheus mounted a partial defence, but illness and disorder blunted any serious resistance. Shapur captured multiple Roman garrisons and claimed victory over the Caesar of the Romans. But the real prize was yet to come. In 253 CE, the Emperor Valerian came to power in Rome. A stern, older statesman, Valerian tried to restore discipline to the empire. He marched east in 254 CE with a large force, determined to halt Sasanian expansion. At first his progress was methodical. He resecured Antioch and moved along the Euphrates. Fortresses were rebuilt, garrisons reorganized. A sense of Roman order returned, however, briefly, but Shapur was not idle. In 259 CE, he launched a sweeping campaign. He moved along the Tigris and Euphrates, ravaging towns and taking captives. He even sent columns into Cappadocia and Cilicia. Roman supply lines crumbled. Disease spread among the legions. And then came Edessa. In 260 CE, the two armies met outside the city. Valerian, with perhaps 70,000 men, hoped to force Shapur into open battle. But the Sasanians, well coordinated and mounted, struck with speed. Arrows rained from cavalry. Roman formations broke. Some historians say betrayal played a role. Others blame illness. Either way, the result was catastrophic. Valerian, Emperor of Rome was captured alive. The moment echoed like thunder. Never before had a Roman emperor been taken prisoner by a foreign power. Shapur had him paraded as a trophy and, according to Persian sources, used him as a footstool when mounting his horse. Whether true or embellished, the symbolism was undeniable. Rome was humiliated, its eastern prestige shattered. In the aftermath, Shapur pressed further, capturing hundreds of Roman towns and deporting tens of thousands to work in Persia. Skilled labourers, especially from Syria, were settled near the Sasanian capital to build bridges, roads and palaces. But even at its lowest ebb, Rome did not vanish. A general named Macrianus seized power in the east. In Palmyra, a client kingdom of Rome, a man named Odenathus began rallying forces. These threads, weak and fraying, would soon weave together into something new. For now, though, the embers burned low. Rome had suffered its greatest humiliation, but the story of the Roman-Persian wars was far from over. Palmyra's answer, 260–267 CE. In the dusty heart of the Syrian desert, amid colonnaded streets and fragrant caravan markets, the city of Palmyra began to stir. Though nominally loyal to Rome, Palmyra was a world unto itself, a wealthy trade hub, blending Roman formality with Eastern flair. And when Rome faltered in the face of Sasanian aggression, it was Palmyra that stepped forward. The man at its centre was Odenathus, a noble of Arab descent, likely descended from tribal chiefs and Eastern aristocrats. Odenathus had watched Shapur's victories with growing alarm. The capture of Valerian sent shockwaves across the east. Roman legions were scattered, cities burned, morale shattered. But where others hesitated, Odenathus acted. At first he offered terms to Shapur, hoping to spare Palmyra from devastation. But Shapur, flush with triumph, dismissed him. That rejection changed everything. Odenathus raised a militia of Palmyrene warriors, desert horsemen, archers, merchants turned soldiers, and began striking at the Sasanian rearguard. What began as raids soon became a campaign. He retook lost towns, ambushed Persian columns, and disrupted their supply lines. Rome took notice. By 261 CE, Odenathus had been named Corrector Totius Orientis, the protector of the entire East. With imperial sanction and growing resources, he marched deep into Mesopotamia. Twice he advanced toward Ctesiphon. Twice the Sasanians repelled him, but with heavy losses. He was no emperor, not yet. But in the east, his name carried the weight of one. Shapur, meanwhile, was slowing. His campaigns had burned brightly, but left his forces thin. The deportations, while enriching Persia's infrastructure, had cost manpower. His court faced challenges from within, even as the Roman tide shifted. By 263 CE, Odenathus had fully restored Roman authority in Syria and much of Mesopotamia. He governed not just as a soldier, but as a statesman. Coins were minted bearing both his and the Emperor Gallienus's names. Eastern legions answered to him. Merchants praised him. Even Rome's Senate, long hesitant, offered recognition. And yet, he never openly challenged Rome. Palmyra was still, outwardly, a Roman city. Latin was spoken in official halls. Imperial standards flew over its gates. But beneath the surface, a new power was rising. Eastern, proud and self-assured. In 266 CE, Odenathus launched one final expedition east, seeking to punish rebellious Arab tribes allied with Persia. His campaign was successful. But in 267 CE, while returning to Palmyra, he and his eldest son were assassinated, perhaps by rival nobles, perhaps by Rome itself. His widow, Zenobia, watched from the palace steps. The fire had been lit. Though Shapur's star was dimming and Palmyra stood ascendant, the east was still a fragile tapestry, fraying at the edges, pulled by ambition and memory. Zenobia's Gambit 267–273 CE. In the silent halls of Palmyra's limestone palace, Zenobia took the reins of power. Widow of Odenathus and regent for her young son Verbalathus, she stood at a crossroads, submission to a fractured Roman court, or the forging of a bold eastern path. She chose the latter. Zenobia was no mere figurehead. She was learned, fluent in multiple languages, Greek, Aramaic, Latin, and perhaps even Egyptian, and surrounded herself with scholars and generals. Her vision was imperial. Her ambition, cloaked in diplomacy, steadily unfolded. Under her rule, Palmyra solidified control over Syria, expanded into Egypt and pushed into Asia Minor. Roman governors in these regions were either overthrown or made to swear loyalty to Vabalithus. Coins were minted bearing both the boy's image and, subtly, hers. The inscriptions were careful, still naming the Emperor Aurelian in Rome. But the power behind the throne was clear. The East had not seen such bold independence since the days of the Seleucids. The Sasanians, watching from across the Euphrates, held their breath. With Rome distracted and Palmyra ascendant, there was opportunity, but also uncertainty. Shapur I had died, and his successors were consolidating power. For now, they watched. Meanwhile, in Rome, Emperor Aurelian had other concerns. Germanic tribes threatened the Danube frontier. The empire's coinage was debased, its roads unsafe. But by 272 CE, having stabilized the west, Aurelian turned east with grim purpose. The Palmyrene War had begun. Aurelian moved swiftly. He marched through Anatolia, reasserting Roman control. Cities that had defected to Palmyra fell one by one. In Egypt, resistance collapsed. Zenobia, rather than retreat, stood firm. Outside Antioch, her forces met the Roman army. The Palmyrines fought fiercely, but Aurelian's cavalry broke their lines. Zenobia retreated to Emesa. There, another battle, another defeat. Finally, she fled toward Persia, seeking Sasanian refuge. But she was captured near the Euphrates. Taken in chains, she was brought to Aurelian. What passed between them remains unclear. Roman sources claim she blamed her advisors. Others say she stood tall, dignified, and unrepentant. In 274 CE, she was paraded through Rome in golden shackles, a symbol of Eastern pride subdued. Palmyra briefly rebelled again, but Aurelian crushed it. The city's grandeur faded, its autonomy ended, and yet Zenobia's name endured. She had dared to build a rival empire in Rome's shadow, and for a few luminous years she had nearly succeeded. In the balance of the Roman-Persian wars, her rebellion had been a wild card, not Persian, not Roman, but something in between. The Sasanians, spared Roman invasion during this interlude, rearmed. Sasanian retaliation and the Emperor's shadow, 274–285 CE. In the years after Zenobia's fall, Rome was again master of the eastern provinces, but the empire remained fragile, fractured by internal instability and pressured by enemies on every frontier. In the east, the Sasanians now saw an opening. Bahram II, successor to Shapur II, had maintained the throne with cautious dignity, but his son and heir, Bahram II, who came to power in 274 CE, had grander ambitions. Persia was not content to watch. It remembered the humiliation of Roman incursions, of Ctesiphon threatened, of eastern satraps swayed by Palmyrene gold. The time had come to restore balance. The conflict began not with a battle, but with whispers. In Armenia, always the hinge of a Roman-Persian rivalry, a new round of intrigues began. The Arsacid rulers there leaned toward Rome, but Persian influence had grown deep roots. Bahram II supported a claimant to the Armenian throne, triggering a contest of loyalty among the highland nobles. Rome, wary and overextended, responded slowly. Meanwhile, Bahram launched raids into Roman Mesopotamia and Syria. Not full invasions, but sharp, probing attacks meant to test the frontier. Cities like Singara and Carrhae fortified their walls. Roman garrisons withdrew into strongholds. The borderlands held, but just barely. Back in Rome, the situation was worse. The Emperor Aurelian had been assassinated in 275 CE. A parade of short-lived rulers followed, Tacitus, Probus, and Carus. Each had victories and setbacks, but none brought lasting stability. It was Carus, in 283 CE, who took the fight east once more. Marching through Anatolia, Carus crossed the Euphrates and advanced swiftly into Sasanian territory. Some sources suggest he even reached Ctesiphon, though whether he captured it remains unclear. The Sasanians, facing internal unrest and a solar eclipse, viewed as an ill omen, did not mount a strong defence. But then, as suddenly as it had begun, the campaign ended. Carus died near the front. Some said it was lightning, others claimed assassination. Whatever the truth, the Roman army retreated. In the chaos, Carus's son Numerian died mysteriously, and the empire again slipped towards civil war. Diocletian, commander of the cavalry, emerged as the victor in 284 CE. In the east, Bahram II held firm, having avoided direct confrontation yet reasserted Sasanian dominance in Armenia. By 285 CE, Rome and Persia agreed to a cautious peace. The Roman-Persian wars had entered a quieter phase, but beneath the stillness, both sides rearmed. Diocletian was not content with defence, and in Persia the royal court was already preparing the next phase of expansion. The eastern reforms of Diocletian 285-298 CE. When Diocletian assumed the purple in 284 CE, he inherited an empire fraying at every seam. The frontiers were porous, the treasury weak, and the army often more loyal to its generals than to the state. The eastern border in particular had become a theatre of uncertainty. Diocletian intended to change that. He did not act in haste. Instead, he restructured. Diocletian's greatest innovation was the tetrarchy, a rule of 4 emperors designed to share power and reduce rebellion. He appointed Maximian as co-emperor in the west, and 2 junior Caesars, Galerius and Constantius. Galerius, a seasoned soldier with a fierce reputation, was tasked with guarding and eventually confronting the Persian frontier. First, Diocletian travelled east himself. From 286 to 290 CE he visited Antioch, Edessa, and the frontier fortresses. He reformed tax systems, reorganized military logistics, and ordered the construction of roads and supply depots throughout Syria and Mesopotamia. Legions were restationed, fortresses repaired. Cities like Nisibis were strengthened, becoming regional strongholds. Persia, for its part, had entered a time of transition. Bahram II had died. His son Bahram III was quickly overthrown, and in 293 CE, Narse, a powerful noble and brother of Shapur II, seized the throne. Narse, ambitious and sharp, rejected the recent peace. He moved quickly to retake Armenia. Narse's armies invaded the highlands, pushing out the pro-Roman Sassanid rulers. Roman garrisons in Armenia were either overrun or withdrawn. By 294 CE, Persia controlled the crucial buffer once more. Galerius, newly appointed Caesar, marched east in response. In 296 CE, he engaged Persian forces near Carrhae, the very ground where Crassus had once fallen. The battle was a disaster. The Roman army was routed, and Galerius withdrew in disgrace. Diocletian, meeting him in Antioch, received him coldly. According to later tradition, Galerius was forced to walk before the emperor's chariot in ceremonial humiliation, but he would have his revenge. In 297 CE, Galerius returned to Armenia. This time, he employed mountain warfare, small columns, rapid movement, ambushes. Narse's forces, heavy with cavalry, were poorly suited for the terrain. The Romans won a decisive battle near Satala. Narse's camp was overrun. His wives, children, and royal treasury were captured. It was a staggering blow. In 298 CE, Narse sued for peace. The Treaty of Nisibis was signed, one of Rome's greatest diplomatic victories in the east. Armenia was returned to Roman influence. 5 satrapies east of the Tigris were ceded. The city of Nisibis was declared the official point of trade between the empires, and for the first time in generations, the Roman eastern frontier was stable. Diocletian's reforms had worked, but the peace would not last forever. The tapestry, for now, had loosened, but beneath the surface, it continued to tighten. Constantine and the Shadow of Persia, 298-337 CE. After the triumph of the Treaty of Nisibis in 298 CE, the eastern frontier settled into an uneasy calm. For nearly 4 decades, the Roman and Sasanian empires refrained from open war. But behind the quiet border, a new generation of leaders emerged, and old ambitions lingered just beneath the surface. Rome, under the guidance of Diocletian and his successors, had restructured itself into a tighter, more durable machine. But in 306 CE, when Constantine claimed the imperial title in the west, the Roman world began to tilt toward transformation. Constantine, thoughtful, ambitious, and deeply political, spent much of his early reign dealing with rivals in Gaul and Italy. Yet he kept a careful eye on the east. Though peace held, the Sasanians were not idle. Shapur II, born in 309 CE and crowned as an infant, was being raised to rule a resurgent Persia. His regency governed with measured strength, rebuilding Sasanian infrastructure and reinforcing the empire's grip on its eastern provinces, while watching the western frontier with care. Constantine, for his part, prepared as if war would one day return. He visited the eastern provinces. Fortresses were reinforced along the Euphrates and Tigris. Strategic towns such as Amida and Nisibis became hubs of administration and supply. The roads between Antioch, Edessa, and the front lines were patrolled, cleared, and repaired. But Constantine's greatest shift was ideological. His conversion to Christianity in the early 4th century and the subsequent Edict of Milan in 313 CE changed Rome's internal structure. The eastern provinces, long a cradle of Christian thought, found new favour and investment. Bishops became administrators. Churches became centres of civic life. Even the army, once a bastion of the old pagan order, began to reflect the emperor's new allegiance. Persia watched these changes with suspicion. The Sasanian court, proudly Zoroastrian, viewed the rise of Christianity in neighbouring Armenia and Roman Mesopotamia as a threat. Christian communities within Persia, once tolerated, now found themselves caught between 2 imperial identities. Accusations of Roman sympathy began to spread, but despite the tension, no war came. Constantine focused instead on internal consolidation and religious reform. He built Constantinople, his new eastern capital, and poured resources into defending the Balkans, the Danube, and the eastern deserts alike. In 324 CE, he defeated his last rival and became sole emperor. That same year, he opened communications with the Sasanian court. Letters of mutual recognition were exchanged. Some sources suggest he even threatened military action on behalf of Persian Christians. Others say he sought an alliance against eastern nomads. The records are murky, but the tone was clear. Rome was watching. When Constantine died in 337 CE, war was on the horizon once more. His sons, inheriting the empire, would face a Persia emboldened under Shapur II, no longer ruled by regents, but by a king hardened and ready. The long silence was about to break. Shapur II and the fires of the East 337-350 CE. The death of Constantine in 337 CE brought a chill to the eastern provinces. The Pax Persica, that had lasted since the Treaty of Nisibis, now teetered. In the shadows of ancient citadels and along the banks of the Euphrates, rumours stirred like wind through desert reeds. Shapur II, now a man of 30, stepped into his full powers, and he had not forgotten Rome's encroachments. Almost immediately, the fragile peace dissolved. Roman forces in Mesopotamia had violated the truce by interfering in Armenian affairs and offering shelter to Christian dissidents from Persia. Shapur II, seeing both insult and opportunity, declared war. He struck hard. In 338 CE, Sasanian armies surged across the Tigris, laying siege to Roman border cities. Nisibis, Rome's great fortress in the east, withstood multiple assaults but suffered terrible damage. Amida and Singara also came under attack. Roman garrisons, now under the fractured leadership of Constantine's sons, Constantius II in the east and his brothers elsewhere, struggled to mount a coordinated defence. The fighting was brutal, but often inconclusive. Sieges dragged on for months, Supply lines were harassed by swift Sasanian cavalry. The rivers that mark the frontier became corridors of raiding and retreat. Civilians fled into the hills or sought refuge behind thick city walls. Christian bishops wrote letters lamenting the destruction. Constantius II, though cautious, was determined. He reorganized the Eastern Command, bringing in fresh troops from the Balkans and Egypt. Engineers repaired forts and dug deeper ditches. Scouts shadowed Shapur's movements. Still, the Sasanians pressed on. In 344 CE, they launched a massive campaign against Mesopotamia, again laying siege to Nisibis. Roman sources describe the use of siege towers, rams, and even floating platforms. The city held, but barely. Its walls were breached in places, the defenders exhausted. Yet the morale of Rome's eastern armies remained intact, hardened, not broken. Meanwhile, Armenia, that perennial hinge, became a battlefield of kings. Rome supported the Arsacid prince Arsaces II, while Shapur backed a rival claimant. The mountains echoed with skirmishes, ambushes, and the clash of war elephants. Control of the region seesawed with the seasons. Through it all, Shapur II revealed himself to be a determined and skillful commander. He blended terror with diplomacy, scorched earth tactics with ritual clemency. He was not another Shapur I, not interested merely in glory, but in reshaping the balance of power. By 350 CE, the war had ground into a deadly rhythm. Neither side could break the other. But the cost in men, silver, and willpower was mounting. The endless siege, Rome and the wall of Nisibis, 350–359 CE. By the early 350s CE, the war between Rome and Persia had settled into a grim rhythm. The frontiers were jagged lines of tension stretching from Armenia to the sands near the Tigris. And at the heart of it all, standing defiant against the eastern wind, was the city of Nisibis. Nisibis, heavily fortified, nestled in the folds of Upper Mesopotamia, was more than a military outpost. It was a symbol. To the Romans, it was proof that the East could be held. To Shapur II, it was a thorn, lodged deep in Persian flesh. In 350 CE, Shapur returned to his campaign with fresh vigour. Though the death of Constans in the west and the rise of the usurper Magnentius had drawn Roman attention away, Constantius II remained focused on the east. The Sasanian king saw his chance, hoping that Rome's divided strength might yield a decisive victory. He gathered a vast army, cavalry from the Iranian plateau, archers from the Zagros valleys, elephants from the south. In 351 CE, he launched another full-scale assault on Nisibis. The siege lasted weeks. The Romans, under Lucilianus and later Count Lucilius, used every trick in the military manual: sorties, night raids, scorched earth tactics, and psychological warfare. The defenders were aided by the city's bishop, Jacob of Nisibis, whose prayers, according to hagiographic tradition, helped bring a rainstorm that flooded Sasanian siege works. Shapur, frustrated but determined, withdrew, only to return in 359 CE for his most ambitious assault yet. This time, he brought an army larger than before, and laid siege not only to Nisibis, but to Amida as well. The latter, less defended, fell after brutal fighting. Its fall sent shockwaves through Roman command. Constantius II, alarmed, raced eastward from the Danube frontier. He reinstated his court at Antioch and called for reinforcements from the western provinces. The entire eastern campaign became one of urgency and tension, every movement shadowed by spies, every hilltop contested. Nisibis, however, endured. Its walls held against the rams, its gates repelled fire. The citizens, hardened by years of siegecraft, carried stones to the parapets and water to the soldiers. Even as Persian sappers tunnelled beneath the walls, the Romans counter-tunnelled, collapsing the enemy's galleries. The siege of 359 ended, once again, in Roman favour. But the cost was immense. Amida lay in ruins. The countryside had been ravaged. Entire communities were displaced. Armenia was slipping further into instability. And Shapur, though denied his prize, remained undeterred. Rome had won another stand, but the war was far from over. Julian's march, the philosopher emperor goes east, 360–363 CE. In the aftermath of the sieges of Nisibis and Amida, Rome's eastern frontier stood bruised but unbroken. Constantius II had managed to hold the line, but the toll had been steep. As whispers of new campaigns circled through the courts of Antioch and Edessa, another figure emerged, one who would gamble everything for a final fateful victory in the east: Julian. A scholar, a soldier, a staunch pagan in a Christian empire, Julian had grown up as both a student of Greek philosophy and a survivor of palace intrigues. Elevated to Caesar in 355 CE by Constantius, he had stunned the western provinces by defeating Germanic tribes and securing the Rhine. Popular with the army, Julian was proclaimed emperor by his troops in 360 CE, a move that set him on a collision course with Constantius. But fate intervened. Constantius II died in 361 CE. Julian, now sole ruler, turned his eyes to the east. It was not just revenge he sought, but glory, a reimagining of Alexander's march guided by omens, oracles, and classical ideals. He believed that Rome could crush Persia not through grinding attrition, but by a swift and daring campaign that struck at the Sasanian heart. In early 363 CE, Julian set out from Antioch with a massive force, some estimate nearly 65,000 men. He travelled light, with minimal baggage and a focus on speed. As spring warmed the Euphrates Valley, the army crossed into Mesopotamia. The campaign began with promise. City after city fell: Anatha, Macapracta, Pirisabora, all taken with minimal resistance. Julian split his forces, sending a contingent northward under Procopius to join with the Armenian king Arsaces III and create a pincer movement. Meanwhile, he led the main column south toward the twin capitals of Ctesiphon and Seleucia. Shapur II, wary after years of brutal frontier warfare, avoided direct battle. Instead, the Persians burned crops, flooded fields, and shadowed the Romans with cavalry. As Julian approached Ctesiphon, he found the city fortified and defended by war elephants and walls thick with archers. He attempted no siege, only a probing assault which faltered. Now, deep in enemy territory, Julian faced a hard choice. With supplies dwindling and Procopius delayed, he began a retreat up the Tigris, seeking a safer path back to Roman lines. Persian forces harried them constantly, cutting off stragglers and ambushing rear guards. The summer heat rose, morale sank. Then, near Samara, disaster struck. In late June 363 CE, during a skirmish, Julian was struck by a spear, some say thrown by a Persian, others suggest friendly fire. He died that night, bleeding beneath the stars, whispering of fate and empire. His death sent shockwaves through the ranks. The army hastily elected Jovian as emperor. Cornered, exhausted and leaderless, Jovian sued for peace. The terms were bitter. Rome surrendered. Nisibis, Singara, and 5 provinces east of the Tigris. Armenian sovereignty was cast into doubt. Julian's campaign, once heralded as a revival of Roman glory, ended as a cautionary tale. The Sasanian lion still roared, and Rome, for now, would retreat behind the river. The price of peace: Roman Persia after Julian 363–378 CE. With the death of Julian in the heat of Mesopotamia, the Roman army found itself vulnerable and exposed. The newly elevated Emperor Jovian faced a bitter truth. Retreat was the only viable option. To secure safe passage for his army, Jovian negotiated directly with Shapur II. The peace treaty, signed hastily in late 363 CE, was one of the most humiliating Rome had agreed to in generations. It ceded to Persia the key cities of Nisibis, Singara, and Castra Morarum, as well as 5 strategic satrapies beyond the Tigris. Armenia, the ever-crucial buffer, was left in political limbo. The eastern provinces mourned. Nisibis, long a symbol of Roman defiance, was evacuated by imperial decree. Its citizens, Roman loyalists, merchants, soldiers, and clergy, were ordered to abandon their homes. Many wept as they crossed into Roman territory, leaving behind a city that had withstood decades of siege only to be handed over in silence. Shapur II entered Nisibis in triumph. He reinforced its walls, restationed his forces, and pressed deeper into Armenia. Though Jovian hoped the treaty would stabilize the east, it instead emboldened Persian ambition. Armenia became the next prize. In 364 CE, following Jovian's sudden death, the brothers Valentinian IV and Valens divided the empire. Valentinian ruled the west from Trier, while Valens governed the east from Constantinople. It was Valens who inherited the task of managing the uneasy peace. Shapur II moved quickly. He installed a pro-Persian king, Pap, on the Armenian throne, but when Pap proved unreliable, tensions rose again. Shapur demanded full Persian control of Armenia. Valens refused. The Armenians, caught between two giants, tried to play both sides, a dangerous game that led to assassinations, betrayals, and palace coups. Yet full war was avoided for now. Valens, wary of renewed conflict, focused on fortifying the Euphrates line. He rebuilt cities, restationed garrisons, and negotiated with Arab allies to monitor desert routes. Meanwhile, Shapur turned eastward, defending his empire against Central Asian incursions. For over a decade, the frontier remained tense but quiet. The balance was precarious, like a glass set on a windowsill during a storm. Every gust of political change in Armenia or Mesopotamia sent tremors through both empires. Then, in 378 CE, the storm broke, but not in the east. At Adrianople, Valens fell in battle against the Goths. The Roman army was shattered. For a moment, the Persian frontier faded into the background, eclipsed by a disaster of imperial proportions. But Shapur II had died in 379 CE after a reign of 70 years. The field was now cleared of old rivals. New emperors, new kings, and new wars loomed on the horizon. The Armenian question, buffer states, and broken kings. 379–387 CE. The passing of Shapur II in 379 CE marked the end of an era in the Roman-Persian wars. His reign had been defined by long campaigns, hard-won sieges, and shifting borders. But it was the fate of Armenia, the enduring fulcrum between the empires, that remained most uncertain. In the power vacuum that followed, both Rome and Persia recalibrated. In the west, Gratian now ruled, a young emperor thrust into prominence after the death of Valentinian I. In the east, Theodosius I rose to power, a general elevated to stem the chaos after the disaster at Adrianople. Meanwhile, in Persia, Ardashir II and then Shapur III inherited the Sasanian throne, each trying to steady the empire after the long shadow of Shapur II. Neither Rome nor Persia had the strength for renewed war, but both sought influence. Armenia, divided by noble factions and religious tensions, became the centerpiece of diplomacy. King Pap's assassination had left a vacuum, and his successors, notably his son Varazdat, struggled to maintain loyalty from the fractious Nakharaz, the Armenian nobility. Roman and Persian envoys flowed into Armenian courts like tides. Bishops, generals, and satraps all played their roles in the great theatre of Eastern politics. Treaties were proposed and broken. Puppet kings were installed, exiled, or executed. The population, mostly Christian, looked westward for support, even as Persian-backed rulers offered favours to Zoroastrian nobles. In 387 CE, an agreement was finally reached. Rome and Persia agreed to partition Armenia. The western portion, smaller but symbolically vital, became a Roman client state. The larger eastern region fell under Persian control, ruled by client kings loyal to Ctesiphon. Though the region was now officially divided, this did little to ease the tension on the ground. Communities were split, families displaced. Churches walked a tightrope between Roman allegiance and Persian suspicion. The Armenian Apostolic Church, asserting its independence, increasingly took on a political as well as spiritual role. This partition, drawn not with blades but with pens, became one of the most consequential diplomatic moments of the Roman-Persian conflict. It reflected a new reality. Neither empire could fully dominate the Caucasus, and so they agreed to share it uneasily for now. But Armenia remained a land of volcanoes beneath the snow, quiet, smouldering, and waiting. Theodosius and the Shadow of the East, 387–395 CE. After the 387 partition of Armenia, the Roman-Persian frontier entered a cautious calm. No border had ever been entirely still, but the grand campaigns that had shaken cities and crowned emperors now gave way to subtler moves. And standing at the helm of the Roman world during this interlude was Theodosius I, a Spaniard by birth, a general by training, and an emperor by necessity. Theodosius had inherited an empire still healing from Adrianople, still reeling from internal fractures. But in the east he brought something rare: stability. He respected the new lines drawn in Armenia and did not seek confrontation with Persia. Instead, he fortified Rome's eastern provinces, not just with stone and sword, but with culture, law, and church. Christianity, now the empire's dominant faith, flourished. In Edessa, Antioch, and Constantinople, churches rose like forest groves. Bishops became regional power brokers. Pilgrims walked to relic sites across Syria and Cappadocia. The Persian court watched all this with wary eyes. Christianity was spreading into their territories, not through invasion, but through ideas. In the Persian Empire, now ruled by Bahram IV and then Yazdegerd I, tolerance of Christianity waxed and waned. While some Sasanian rulers offered measured acceptance, others viewed Christians as potential fifth columns, a Roman religion at odds with Zoroastrian orthodoxy. And so began a quieter war, a war of conversions, exiles, theological councils, and borderland skirmishes. Theodosius saw the threat, but chose not to escalate. Instead, he brokered agreements with Arab tribes and local kings to patrol the deserts and river valleys between the two great realms. The Ghassanids and Lakhmids, vassal kingdoms on either side of the frontier, became Rome and Persia's proxies, raiding, spying, and sometimes protecting. This was the chessboard now, more subtle, more complex. Theodosius spent his final years balancing the world's weights. He outlawed pagan rituals in the cities, but allowed some to persist in private. He restructured the bureaucracy of the Eastern Court. He walked carefully in Armenia, supporting the church while avoiding open interference with Persian suzerainty. In 395 CE, Theodosius died, the last emperor to rule both East and West as a united empire. He left the Roman world to his sons, Arcadius in the east and Honorius in the west. Arcadius inherited the Sasanian frontier, not in flames but in smouldering tension. Behind him, Theodosius left a fortified peace. Ahead, the eastern winds began to stir again. Arcadius and Yazdegerd, diplomacy in an age of division, 395–420 CE. When Theodosius I died in 395 CE, the Roman world divided once more, perhaps for good. In the west, the young and unprepared Honorius would soon face invasions by Visigoths and the slow collapse of Roman control. But in the east, under Arcadius, the empire turned inward, bureaucratic, courtly, cautious. It was a strange calm on the Persian frontier. In Persia, the throne passed to Yazdegerd I, a curious and often misunderstood figure in Sasanian history. Known to some as Yazdegerd the Sinner, and to others as a wise reformer, he opened his reign with gestures of peace toward Rome. And for the first time in generations, those gestures were returned. Arcadius, ever watchful of Western chaos, preferred diplomacy to arms, and Yazdegerd, ruling an empire weary from Shapur's long wars, saw value in stability. An agreement was reached. Armenia remained divided, but each empire respected the current arrangement. Rome retained control of the smaller western segment, while Persia ruled the larger eastern portion through client kings. The Armenian Apostolic Church, now formally separate from both the Roman and Persian ecclesiastical systems, became a balancing force, working to maintain Armenian identity amid foreign rule. The most surprising twist came in the form of royal guardianship. When Arcadius died in 408 CE, he left behind a young son, Theodosius II. According to some sources, Arcadius entrusted Yazdegerd I with the role of protector, an honorary guardianship of sorts, not over the West, but as a symbolic gesture of goodwill. Whether ceremonial or real, this moment marked an unprecedented high in Roman-Persian relations. Yazdegerd treated Roman envoys with respect. He allowed Christian churches to flourish in Mesopotamia, even granting favour to bishops once exiled. Some saw him as a Persian Constantine, a ruler willing to blend tolerance with imperial authority. But this peace was not without shadows. In the Roman East, court intrigue simmered. Empress Aelia Eudoxia wielded power in Arcadius's later years, and after his death, bureaucrats like Anthemius governed in the name of the child emperor. While outwardly calm, the court feared disruption from all sides: Goths in the Balkans, Huns beyond the Caucasus, and Sasanian shifts that might swing from peace to war. In Persia, Yazdegerd's tolerance alienated Zoroastrian clergy and nobles. His policies, while stabilizing in some ways, were viewed as too friendly to Christians and foreign customs. When he died in 420 CE, Persia fell into dynastic unrest, and with his death, the peace unravelled. In less than a year, border raids resumed. A fragile balance had held, not from strength, but from personality. Yazdegerd's careful rule and Arcadius's passivity had postponed conflict, but the forces beneath still burned. Shadows over the Tigris, war and revolt, 420–422 CE. With the death of Yazdegerd IV in 420 CE, the Persian court entered a storm of intrigue. The Zoroastrian clergy, having long resented his tolerance toward Christians and foreign customs, now moved swiftly to reassert their dominance. They backed Khosrow, son of Bahram IV, as a new ruler, but the army had other ideas. Out of this chaos emerged Bahram V, known as Bahram Gur, a prince of noble blood, a hunter, a patron of poetry, and a warrior with something to prove. He seized power with the help of Arab allies and returned to Ctesiphon with promises to restore Persian tradition and strength. In Rome, Theodosius Segor watched carefully. The fragile peace established by Yazdegerd was crumbling. Bahram's rise coincided with a wave of persecution against Christians in Persia. Churches were shuttered, bishops imprisoned, and Christian soldiers dismissed. Roman envoys demanded clemency. Bahram refused. Tensions flared into war. In 421 CE, Theodosius II ordered the eastern legions to march. The commander Ardabur led Roman forces across the frontier. They advanced quickly into Sasanian and Mesopotamia, encountering only scattered resistance. But Bahram was gathering strength. He avoided open battle, instead using scorched earth tactics and light cavalry to harass supply lines. The Romans reached Nisibis, now under Persian control, but found it too well defended to assault directly. Summer burned across the plains. Meanwhile, internal dissent brewed. In Persia, not all were eager for renewed war. Many nobles still favoured accommodation with Rome. The Christian minority, long influential in the cities of the West, became both a liability and a bargaining chip. Bahram cracked down harder, and then nature intervened. In early 422 CE, floods along the Tigris swelled rivers and turned roads to mud. Roman forces slowed. Diseases spread in the camps. Morale faltered. Peace talks began. Through intermediaries, including Christian bishops from both sides, a treaty was drafted. The terms were modest: a return to the status quo ante bellum, religious tolerance promised by both sides, and Armenian borders reaffirmed. It was not a triumph, but it was peace. Bahram Gur, his throne now secure, turned inward to rebuild. Theodosius II refocused on fortifications and theological councils, and the Tigris flowed quietly again. For a moment, the quiet watch, guarding the frontier, 423–440 CE. After the Treaty of 422 CE, the border between Rome and Persia settled into a rare and delicate calm. The land that had echoed with the tramp of armies and the creak of siege towers now hummed with more mundane sounds. The whistle of wind through fields, the murmur of traders crossing checkpoints, the chants of monks in distant monasteries. This was not peace born of alliance, it was peace of exhaustion. On the Roman side, Theodosius II focused his energy inward. He oversaw legal reforms. The Theodosian Code took shape under his reign, and strengthened the cities of the East with walls and bureaucrats. Constantinople grew ever more the heart of the Eastern Empire, its golden dome casting shadows far beyond the Bosphorus. The eastern frontier, meanwhile, was overseen by generals who preferred diplomacy to confrontation. They met their Persian counterparts in cautious conferences on neutral ground, exchanging news, gifts, and veiled threats. It was a dance of empires, slow, formal, tense. Persia, under Bahram V and then Yazdegerd II, also turned inward. Bahram's later years were marked more by literature and legend than by war. His court hosted poets and storytellers. Tales of his hunting feats and courtly romances spread across the land, becoming part of Persian folklore. But beneath the surface, vigilance remained. Both sides fortified their borderlands. Watchtowers rose along the Euphrates. Outposts at Dara, Amida, and Theodosiopolis received fresh supplies and troops. Trade flourished, but so did espionage. Caravans were searched, letters intercepted. Missionaries watched closely. The Lakhmids and Ghassanids, Arab allies of Persia and Rome respectively, kept the desert routes under surveillance. These client kingdoms grew in prominence, often acting as the first line of both defence and offence. Their raids, alliances, and blood feuds became part of imperial strategy. Religious tensions simmered quietly. Christianity continued to expand in the Roman East, but doctrinal disputes, particularly over the nature of Christ, began to split the church. Nestorianism, declared heretical in Rome, found refuge in Persia, where it was adopted by many Eastern Christian communities as a distinct expression of faith, both theological and political. Persia, wary of Roman influence through the church, increasingly used religion as a tool of statecraft. Yazdegerd II, who succeeded Bahram V, viewed the Christian minority with suspicion, especially those tied to Roman clerical structures. But no war erupted, the frontier held. For 17 years, from 423 to 440 CE, the Tigris and Euphrates marked more than a boundary of stone. They marked a boundary of restraint, hard won, hard held. And while armies rested and capitals busied themselves with law, learning, and ceremony, the war stories of the past whispered through barracks and bazaars. Everyone knew this silence would not last forever. The fire beneath the ash, Yazdegerd II and the gathering, storm 440–457 CE. In the twilight of the mid-5th century, the Roman and Persian empires stood like weary sentinels, each guarding its borders, each peering into the shifting shadows beyond. But peace, as ever, was a season, not a climate. Beneath the surface of quiet diplomacy and tightened defences, the old fires stirred again. Theodosius II still reigned in the east, his rule defined by theological debates and legal codices. In Persia, Yazdegerd II had taken the throne after Bahram Gur, a ruler more austere, more calculating, and increasingly suspicious of Roman intentions. He saw religion not just as belief, but as allegiance. Christianity had grown among Persian subjects, not just in the Roman-aligned West, but deep into Persian cities. And while Rome splintered into theological factions, Yazdegerd moved to unify his realm through Zoroastrian orthodoxy. In 442 CE, he issued edicts demanding conformity. Churches were closed, clergy were arrested, and worst of all for Christians, especially in Armenia and Assyria, forced conversions began. Many resisted, quietly in some places, defiantly in others. Rome took notice. Theodosius's court, preoccupied with doctrinal councils and barbarian threats in the west, could do little militarily. But envoys were sent. Letters were exchanged. Border commanders were told to prepare quietly, but no open war was declared. In Armenia, the pressure broke. There, Christian nobles, led by the brave and eloquent Vardan Mamikonian, refused Yazdegerd's command to convert. The Armenian church stood firm, and with it, an armed rebellion rose. In 451 CE, the famed Battle of Carrhae was fought. The Persians won the battle. Vardan fell, but the Armenians won something greater: martyrdom, memory, and eventual autonomy. Though crushed militarily, the revolt convinced Yazdegerd and his successors that Armenia could not be easily assimilated. The Roman Empire, unable to openly intervene, watched from the sidelines. Still, the unrest disrupted the fragile balance. Roman generals reinforced key fortresses along the eastern line. Messages passed in cipher through mountain monasteries. Trade slowed, spies multiplied. Then, in 450 CE, Theodosius II died in a fall from his horse. He left behind no sons. His sister, Pulcheria, quickly married the seasoned general Marcian, who became emperor. Marcian, known for his no-nonsense style, signalled a tougher stance. But Yazdegerd II's days were numbered. He died in 457 CE, leaving behind a nervous succession and a divided empire. And on both sides of the frontier, old generals remembered old campaigns. They waited. The age of interlude, kings, councils, and quiet marches, Horodom 475 CE. With the death of Yazdegerd II in 457 CE and the recent ascension of Marcian in the Roman East, both empires found themselves under the guidance of leaders chosen more for stability than expansion. These were years of interlude, not without movement, but marked more by subtle shifts than sweeping campaigns. In Persia, the throne passed to Hormizd III, but his reign was brief and contested. His brother, Peroz, rose against him with the backing of the powerful Hephthalites, nomadic warriors from the eastern steppes who would soon play a more dangerous role in the region. By 459 CE, Hormizd was dead, and Peroz reigned alone. Peroz's rule began with reform and promise, but shadows gathered quickly. To the west, the Roman Emperor Marcian died in 457 CE, succeeded by Leo the Fencer, a Thracian by birth and the first Eastern Roman emperor to be crowned by the Patriarch of Constantinople, a signal of how deeply the Church now wove itself into imperial identity. Leo was cautious but ambitious. He restructured military command, favouring Isaurian officers who were loyal but unpredictable. His general Aspar, of Alan descent and a powerful figure at court, became both a kingmaker and a destabilising force. The East grew wealthy and fortified, but politically brittle. Despite internal manoeuvrings, Rome and Persia kept their peace. Peroz, though concerned about Roman support for Christian movements in the East, had greater worries. In 464 CE, he was defeated by the Hephthalites, the very force that had once helped him ascend. Forced to pay tribute, he temporarily abandoned plans for Western engagement. Meanwhile, Leo I invested in infrastructure. Fortresses in Osroene and Mesopotamia were reinforced. A new wall was raised in Constantinople. Religious tensions were managed, though not resolved. Chalcedonian orthodoxy now dominated the imperial church, while Nestorian Christians continued to grow in Persian lands. Traders crossed the frontier. Envoys passed through Armenian valleys. There were no major battles, but the frontier was never quiet. Skirmishes flared in the mountains. Small rebellions among Arab clients flickered and died. But on the whole, both powers, stretched by internal complexities and eastern distractions, chose watchfulness over war. The Armenian highlands, now more autonomous but still contested, remained a cultural and strategic chessboard. The memory of Vardan Mamikonian's resistance was fresh, and his legacy shaped how both empires approached the region. By 475 CE, Peroz was again planning an eastern campaign, and in Constantinople, Leo's death marked the rise of Zeno, a man whose reign would be defined by turbulence and eventually conflict on the eastern frontier. Catastrophe in the east, the fall of Peroz, 475-484 CE. As the final quarter of the 5th century began, The calm that had held along the Roman-Persian frontier started to crumble, not from the west, but from far beyond the eastern horizon. Perros, king of kings of Persia, was determined to shake off the humiliation of his earlier defeat at the hands of the Hephthalites. These nomadic steppe warriors, sometimes called the White Huns, had become a formidable power in Central Asia. They had extracted tribute, forced humiliating terms, and now cast a long shadow over Persia's eastern provinces. While Zeno reigned in Constantinople, embroiled in court intrigues and the shifting loyalties of the Isaurians, Perros raised a great army. He was determined to reclaim lost honour. In 481 CE, he launched a campaign deep into Hephthalite lands. It was ambitious, risky, and logistically difficult. The campaign lasted several years, with back-and-forth skirmishes and moments of apparent success. But the Hephthalites were not a people easily broken. They avoided open battle, drawing the Persian forces further east, into the dry highlands and unknown valleys. Supplies thinned, communication lines stretched. In 484 CE, the trap was sprung. At the Battle of Herat, or perhaps further north near Balkh, the Hephthalites encircled the Persian army. Perros was killed, along with many nobles and officers. It was a catastrophe of rare magnitude. For the first time in generations, the Sasanian Empire stood leaderless and exposed. News reached Ctesiphon like a storm rolling off the steppe. Panic spread. A usurper tried to seize the throne, but the nobles rallied around Balash, a brother of Perros. His reign began in chaos, tasked first with negotiating peace and stabilizing a realm teetering on collapse. The Hephthalites demanded renewed tribute, and they got it. In Rome, Zeno observed with cold detachment. While he had little love for Persia, he also feared instability that might ripple west. No military move was made, but Roman emissaries watched closely. Along the border, fortresses were strengthened. Armenian nobles, long courted by both sides, reassessed their loyalties. Some whispered of a Roman return to deeper influence in the east. But the Roman Empire, though vigilant, had troubles of its own. Revolts in Asia Minor, Gothic factions in the Balkans, and theological battles in the heart of the Church consumed its energy. The fall of Perros was more than a military defeat. It was a hinge in the great door of history, swinging open to reveal a changed world. Persia, humiliated but still powerful, would soon rise again, but its eastern wounds would shape its western posture for decades to come. Kavad's gamble, reform and rebellion, 484-498 CE. In the uneasy quiet after Perros's defeat, the Persian Empire clung to its dignity. Balash, the new Shah, did what he could, but he lacked the authority to govern a realm in disarray. He made peace with the Hephthalites, promised religious tolerance, and tried to soothe rebellious nobles. But it was not enough. By 488 CE, Balash was deposed. In his place rose Kavad, a young and determined ruler, the son of Perros, returning from exile among the very Hephthalites who had destroyed his father. Kavad was sharp, patient, and ambitious. He had learned that Persia needed more than tradition to survive. He would try something radical. Kavad supported a religious movement known as Mazdakism, a proto-socialist sect that preached communal living, charity, and the redistribution of wealth. Its founder, Mazdak, claimed divine wisdom and challenged the power of the aristocracy and Zoroastrian clergy alike. This was more than spiritual reform. It was political revolution. Kavad saw in Mazdakism a tool, a way to break the power of the nobility and clergy, to lift the burdens of the poor, and to centralize control in the throne. He endorsed it publicly. Reforms were enacted. Land and wealth were seized from nobles. Temples lost influence. The aristocracy seethed. In Rome, Emperor Anastasius I, who had ascended in 491 CE, watched events in Persia with growing interest. A reformer himself, Anastasius, was reorganizing the Roman tax system and improving fortifications, especially in the east. He understood, perhaps better than most, that upheaval in Persia could mean both danger and opportunity. For a time, the Roman-Persian border remained quiet, But inside Persia, unrest boiled. By 496 CE, the nobility had had enough. Kavad was overthrown and imprisoned in the Castle of Oblivion, a fortress in the remote mountains. The nobles installed his brother, Jamasp, as a puppet king. It might have ended there. But Kavad escaped. With help from loyalists, and again with Hephthalite support, he returned in 498 CE at the head of a renewed army. Persia braced for another civil conflict, but resistance crumbled quickly. Kavad reclaimed the throne. He was older now, wiser, and more dangerous. Mazdakism would remain for a time, but Kavad no longer ruled as its mere champion. He ruled as a sovereign who had survived betrayal, exile, and war. He would now look to rebuild and to reshape Persia in ways no one expected. And on the Roman frontier, change was coming too. Anastasius had begun building a mighty fortress at Dara, a direct challenge to Persian dominance in the region. The road to Anastasius' war, foundations of a coming storm, 498–502 CE. By the end of the 5th century, the Roman and Persian empires stood like two great statues, weathered, scarred, but still towering over their shared frontier. They had avoided full-scale war for decades, but the wind had begun to shift. Behind closed doors, both empires laid plans. The silence was not peace. It was preparation. Kavad Fas, back on the throne in Persia, wasted no time. The rebellion had shaken him, but it had also clarified his purpose. He balanced the influence of Mazdakism with careful patronage of the clergy and nobles. It was a delicate dance. One misstep, and Persia could fracture again. To the east, the threat of the Hephthalites remained. Kavad knew he would need a stronger, richer, more stable Persia to face it. And so he turned to the west, to the Romans, not with threats, but with a request. In 502 CE, Kavad asked Emperor Anastasius IV for financial assistance. Officially, it was framed as a friendly loan to support border defences and internal projects. But everyone understood the subtext, tribute by another name. Anastasius refused. The Roman court saw the request as overreach. Anastasius, a frugal and capable administrator, had spent his reign shoring up the imperial treasury, improving tax systems, and finishing the massive fortress of Dara in Mesopotamia, a direct counter to Persian strength. To pay Persia now would have seemed a betrayal of Roman pride. Kavad was insulted, and so, quietly, the wheels of war began to turn. Persian scouts mapped the frontier. Messages passed through Armenian monasteries and Arab outposts. The garrison at Nisibis began training more frequently. Roman border generals petitioned for reinforcements. Spies whispered of movements in the Zagros. Both sides understood what was coming. The war that would break out in 502 would not be a surprise. It would be the culmination of years of rivalry, mistrust, and unresolved ambition. The tapestry had been tightening since the first war of Parthians and Romans, and now, at the dawn of a new century, it was ready to tear. The Roman-Persian wars were about to enter a new and ferocious chapter. The calm before the tempest, Justinian's legacy, and the Eastern standoff, 550–562 CE. In the year 550 CE, the long shadow of Emperor Justinian stretched across the Roman world. His great reconquests in the west had reclaimed Italy, Africa, and parts of Spain for the empire. His legal code had reshaped law. His architectural marvels, like the Hagia Sophia, stood as testaments to imperial ambition. But on the eastern frontier, where the Roman and Persian worlds pressed uneasily against one another, peace held, barely. The eternal war, which had erupted in 526 and dragged on with devastating cost, had ended in 545 with an armistice, and finally in 562 with a formal treaty. But between those years, from 550 to 562, a strange stillness gripped the frontier, neither full war nor real peace. Both empires needed time. Justinian, aging and increasingly withdrawn, was focused on finishing his vision, but the empire's coffers had been strained by war and plague. The great cities of the east, from Antioch to Edessa, were rebuilding after Persian raids and earthquakes. The The Anatolian highlands and Mesopotamian plains bore scars that would take generations to fade. Khosrow I, known as Anushirvan, the immortal soul, ruled Persia with firm and calculating hands. He was a reformer, philosopher-king, and ruthless tactician. Having stabilized his realm after years of internal turmoil, he now eyed the west with suspicion and quiet ambition. Skirmishes continued in the Caucasus, where Iberia, eastern Georgia, and Lazica, western Georgia, served as perpetual battlegrounds and diplomatic tightropes. Rome and Persia vied for influence in the mountainous passes, funding client kings, fortifying strongholds, and exchanging threats through envoys cloaked in politeness. Lazica, in particular, saw intermittent conflict during these years. Roman forces garrisoned its fortresses. Persian troops sought to uproot them. The dense forests and high ridges echoed with the clash of swords and the rustle of spies. But the war never fully reignited. Instead, both sides worked to consolidate. Khosrow focused on internal reforms, revamping the tax system, reorganizing provincial governance, and strengthening Zoroastrian religious institutions. He also invested heavily in philosophy and science, drawing scholars from across the known world to his court in Ctesiphon. In Constantinople, Justinian tried to secure his legacy. He fortified the empire's eastern cities, funded monasteries along the frontier, and sent lavish gifts to Arab tribal leaders to secure the desert flanks. The Ghassanids, Rome's Arab allies, and the Lakhmids, Persia's loyal clients, skirmished in the vast steppe-like plains of the Syrian desert, testing each other in raids and retaliations. These small-scale battles served as proxy wars, where camels replaced cavalry charges, and water sources were worth more than fortresses. Religious tension also simmered. Christianity continued to fragment, and Justinian's attempts to enforce Chalcedonian orthodoxy were met with resistance, particularly in the eastern provinces where monophysitism held sway. Khosrow, ever the opportunist, welcomed Christian sects deemed heretical in Rome, using them as both a political wedge and cultural enrichment. The peace talks that led to the 562 treaty were long and winding. Envoys met in Dara, Nisibis, and other border cities, sometimes for weeks at a time. They debated not just land and tribute, but trade routes, the treatment of religious minorities, and the flow of pilgrims to holy sites. Finally, in the spring of 562, the 50-year peace was signed. It was a remarkable achievement, on paper. Rome agreed to pay Persia a substantial annual subsidy, euphemistically described as a contribution toward the defense of the Caucasus. Borders were reaffirmed, fortresses were returned, trade resumed. But beneath the signatures and wax seals, both sides knew this was not the end. It was only a pause. Khosrow had seen Justinian's empire stretch thin. Justinian had seen the cunning behind Khosrow's courtesies. Each understood the other too well to believe in lasting peace, and in the desert, in the mountains, in the monasteries and palaces of East and West, the next generation waited. A shifting balance, the War of 572 and the cracks in the 50-year peace. 562-576 CE, the 50-year peace, signed with ceremony in 562 CE, was not destined to live out its name. For though the ink dried and the gifts were exchanged, the hearts of emperors and kings seldom rested so long. Justinian died in 565, passing the throne to his nephew Justin II, a man proud, energetic, and far less cautious. Justinian's careful dance of diplomacy was replaced by a new tone, impatient, fiery, and easily provoked. Khosrow I, still ruling in Persia, had grown older but no less watchful. He sensed the change in Constantinople, and in the quiet between 562 and 572, he fortified his position, investing in border infrastructure, tightening alliances with the Lakhmids, and maintaining pressure in the Caucasus. Tensions first flared over religious disputes and the treatment of Christians in Persian lands, especially in Armenia. There, Roman sympathies lingered, and the local nobility bristled under Persian control. Roman agents fanned those flames, encouraging resistance, offering protection. Then, in 572, the spark caught fire. Armenian nobles, emboldened by Roman assurances, revolted against Persian garrisons. The rebellion spread like brushfire through mountain passes and valleys. Khosrow responded with force, and in turn Justin II declared war. Thus began a new phase of conflict, often called the War of 572–591. Roman armies pushed into Mesopotamia, seizing border fortresses like Dara and Nisibis. Skirmishes erupted across the Syrian plains. Persian forces counterattacked with precision, led by seasoned generals. One such leader, Khosrow, became a feared name among Roman troops. The cities of the frontier, Amida, Callinicum, Martyropolis, were once again places of siege and suffering, but the war also stretched far north. In Iberia and Lazica, once considered marginal theatres, both empires poured in troops. Local kings shifted allegiance depending on the tide, and battles were waged not just with swords but with gold, bribes, and marriages. By 575, it became clear this war would not be short. The strain wore heavily on Justin II. Reports of defeat, of cities lost, of troops deserting, the emperor's mind began to fray. In 574, gripped by a growing madness, he named his general Tiberius as Caesar, stepping back from direct rule. Tiberius, practical and respected, stabilized the empire. He reorganized supply lines, reinforced Anatolian fortresses, and negotiated a truce with Khosrow, a temporary ceasefire that offered both sides a breath. But it would not hold. In 576, the war reignited. Khosrow himself led a bold invasion into Roman territory, crossing the Euphrates and sacking the city of Sebastia in Armenia Minor. His army, laden with loot, began to withdraw, but at Melitene, Roman forces struck back. It was a rout. Khosrow barely escaped with his life. The shock rippled through Persia. The war, once thought a mere frontier correction, now threatened the prestige of the King of Kings. Rome, meanwhile, had tasted unexpected triumph. The fall of kings, from Khosrow to Hormizd, and the rise of Bahram Chobin, 576–590 CE. In the wake of Khosrow-Fal's near capture at Melitene in 576, the war ground onward. Roman morale soared, while in Persia, cracks began to widen beneath the carefully laid foundations of the old king's reforms. Khosrow, now an aging monarch, returned to Ctesiphon deeply shaken. His court grew divided, some advocating renewed aggression, others urging a more cautious peace. Khosrow died in 579, leaving the throne to his son Hormizd IV. Hormizd inherited a battlefield, a proud yet strained empire, and a war that had already lasted longer than most expected. He was not his father. Hormizd's reign began with promise. He brought a stern administrative focus to the empire, continuing his father's infrastructure projects and cracking down on corruption. But he ruled with a cold detachment that alienated the nobility, the priesthood, and even the army. Meanwhile, Tiberius II had become Augustus in the Roman East, after Justin II's death. Under his leadership, Roman generals like Maurice, who would later become emperor, pressed their advantage. Battles in Armenia, Mesopotamia, and along the Euphrates continued with grinding regularity. In 582, Maurice became emperor. He was a soldier emperor, keen to end the war decisively. By the late 580s, Persia was facing internal strain. Rebellions flared in the east. The army, long loyal to the crown, grew restless, and into this unrest stepped a man of formidable talent, Bahram Chobin. Bahram was a general of noble birth, tall, commanding, and brilliant on the battlefield. He won a string of victories in the east, pushing back the Hephthalites and securing Persia's fragile frontier. But his growing fame alarmed Hormizd IV. In a decision that would haunt him, Hormizd publicly humiliated Bahram after a minor setback, stripping him of command and accusing him of arrogance. The insult was too deep to ignore. Bahram rebelled. With a loyal army and support from many in the nobility, he marched on Ctesiphon. Hormizd, increasingly isolated, was overthrown in a palace coup and blinded. His son, Khosrow II, was raised to the throne, but Bahram was not finished. Claiming to purge the empire of a corrupt dynasty, Bahram advanced on the capital. Khosrow II fled, seeking aid where few would have expected: Constantinople. The Roman Emperor Maurice, seeing a golden opportunity, welcomed Khosrow as an honoured guest. A deal was struck. In exchange for Roman military support to reclaim his throne, Khosrow would cede border fortresses and recognise Roman influence in Armenia. So began a strange and momentous alliance. Roman legions marched east, not to invade Persia, but to restore a Persian king. Together with loyalist Persian forces, they confronted Bahram Chobin in 591 CE. At the Battle of Blarathon, near the plains of Media, Bahram's forces were defeated. He fled east, later assassinated by rivals. Khosrow II returned to Ctesiphon in triumph. It was a rare moment. Rome and Persia had made war together, and for once the frontier quieted. But peace born of necessity is seldom lasting. Brothers in arms, enemies in waiting, the restoration of Khosrow II and the turning tide, 591-602 CE. The victory at Blarathon in 591 CE marked a moment rare in Roman-Persian history. The armies of Constantinople and Ctesiphon had fought side by side. For the first time in memory, Roman eagles and Persian standards flew together over a battlefield. Khosrow II was restored, not merely by Persian loyalty, but by Roman intervention. In return, the grateful Khosrow ceded several key cities and territories in northern Mesopotamia and Armenia to Emperor Maurice. Trade resumed along the Silk Road routes. The frontier for once grew quiet. For a decade, the silence held. It was a time of delicate cooperation. Roman envoys walked freely through Persian courts, and Persian traders re-entered the cities of Syria and Anatolia. Along the edges of the empire, life cautiously resumed its rhythms. Farmers returned to abandoned fields. Monasteries rebuilt their libraries. Roads once pocked by hoofprints of war now saw the steady passage of grain and silk. Khosrow II, known as Parviz, the Victorious, turned his attention to domestic reforms. He expanded palatial building projects, invested in irrigation, and strengthened royal authority. He rewarded his Roman allies with tribute and praise, and for a time the two great powers stood less like rivals and more like wary neighbours. But the seeds of betrayal had already been sown, not in Persia, but in Constantinople. Emperor Maurice, a veteran soldier and careful administrator, faced growing discontent. His military campaigns in the Balkans, though successful, were deeply unpopular. Troops stationed on the Danube grumbled at harsh winters and unpaid wages. In 602, when Maurice ordered his army to remain beyond the Danube for the winter, it was too much. The mutiny began with whispers, then with refusal. Finally, it became open revolt. The army proclaimed a new emperor, Phocas, a low-ranking officer with ambition and fury. Maurice was overthrown. He and his sons were executed, thrown into the sea before a jeering crowd. The empire shuddered. Khosrow II, who had once owed his throne to Maurice, now saw an opportunity. He declared that the murder of his benefactor was an affront not only to friendship, but to divine order. He would march, not just to avenge Maurice, but to reclaim what had once been Persian. In the winter of 602-603, the Roman-Persian War began anew, but this time it would be different. This was not a war of border skirmishes or client kings. This was not a dispute over treaties or tribute. This was a war of vengeance and ambition, a war that would engulf both empires and leave their legacies forever changed. The fury of Parviz, Persia's invasion, and the fall of Roman cities, 603-611 CE. When Khosrow II launched his war of retribution in 603 CE, few in the Roman world could have predicted the scale of what was to come. What began as a campaign to avenge Emperor Maurice soon transformed into a tidal wave of conquest. Phocas, the new Roman emperor, proved unpopular and unstable. His brutal rise to power had left the Byzantine court fractured. Provinces once loyal to Constantinople simmered with resentment. The army, distrustful and underpaid, fought without enthusiasm. Into this chaos, Khosrow's forces advanced. The Persian war machine, revitalized under Khosrow's reign, moved swiftly. Commanders like Shahrbaraz and Shahin led elite units across the Tigris and into Roman Mesopotamia. Cities fell one after another: Dara, Amida, Edessa. Roman garrisons surrendered or were swept aside. Persian banners soon fluttered over lands not seen since the time of Darius. In 608, Khosrow's armies pushed beyond the Euphrates. Antioch, jewel of the Roman East, was besieged and taken. Churches burned, markets emptied, refugees fled westward, pouring into Anatolia and the Levant. The frontier had not simply shifted, it had collapsed. Still, the deeper the Persians pressed into Roman lands, the more they strained their supply lines. Winter brought slowdowns, but not defeat. Persian generals rotated their armies skillfully, using captured cities as forward bases. Phocas, unable to halt the advance, turned inward. His paranoia deepened. He executed officers, suspected traitors, and even members of his own family. Constantinople grew grim and quiet. The people, once proud of their empire, now watched helplessly as the east was carved away. By 610, Heraclius, the son of the Exarch of Africa, set sail from Carthage. With a fleet behind him and growing support, he reached Constantinople and deposed Phocas. The usurper was executed on the steps of the imperial palace. Heraclius inherited an empire in ruins, but in his first acts he did not seek war. Instead, he sued for peace with Khosrow. Khosrow rejected the offer. He had no intention of stopping. To the Persian king, Heraclius was an illegitimate ruler, an opportunist who had risen by the same violence that had toppled Maurice. He would not negotiate with a murderous successor, and so the war continued. By 611, Persian armies reached Chalcedon, directly across the Bosphorus from Constantinople itself. Citizens of the capital could see Persian campfires from the city walls. The empire's heart trembled. Never before had a Persian force stood so close. The turning tide, Heraclius' campaigns, and the long march to recovery, 612, 619 CE and 612 CE, the Byzantine Empire stood on the brink. Persian forces had reached Chalcedon, casting long shadows across the Bosphorus. The empire's armies were scattered, the treasury drained. Heraclius, barely 2 years on the throne, ruled a capital gripped by fear. Yet it was here, amid despair, that he began his rise. Heraclius was not merely a naval commander or the son of an African exarch. He was a thinker, a reformer, and a man of deep resilience. In the face of Persian triumph, he began to rebuild. His first steps were not on the battlefield, but in the palace. He restructured the Byzantine administration, cut expenses, and reorganized the military into more efficient thematic units. He minted new coinage, reorganized land grants, and forged tighter bonds with provincial governors. By 613, he was ready to move. Persian gains had not slowed. Shahrbaraz, one of Khosrow's most skilled generals, led campaigns through Syria and into Palestine. Cities fell in grim succession: Apamea, Damascus, Emesa. Then, in 614, came the greatest blow of all: Jerusalem. The holy city fell to Persian forces. The True Cross, one of Christendom's most revered relics, was seized and carried back east. Churches burned, and thousands were killed or enslaved. For the Christian world, it was not merely a military defeat, it was a spiritual catastrophe. Heraclius's response was slow, methodical, and increasingly inspired by religious imagery. He framed his struggle as a holy war, not just for empire, but for faith itself. He travelled through Anatolia, rallying troops, visiting bishops, and invoking divine purpose. In 615, he launched a counter-offensive, but was repelled. His armies were still too weak. Constantinople remained under constant threat. Yet by 617, the tide began to turn. Heraclius forged an alliance with the Avars and Slavs in the Balkans, buying time to regroup in the east. He negotiated with nomadic tribes along the Caucasus, opening paths through Armenia. Then, In 618 and 619, he struck again. This time it was not in the open plains of Mesopotamia, but in the highlands of eastern Anatolia and Armenia. There, his reorganized troops achieved small but crucial victories, harassing Persian supply lines, retaking minor fortresses, and emboldening local resistance. Khosrow, overconfident, dismissed the threat. He believed the empire broken. He did not see that Heraclius had begun a war of attrition, not by overwhelming might, but by careful positioning and psychological resolve. In monasteries across Anatolia, monks prayed for victory. In the streets of Constantinople, sermons spoke of redemption and endurance. The war had become something more than a struggle for land. It had become a battle for the soul of the empire. The tapestry, threadbare and trembling, began to weave anew. The Alpine strategy, Heraclius in Armenia, and the reversal of fortune 620-622 CE. By 620 CE, Heraclius had grown into his command. No longer the uncertain ruler of a collapsing empire, he now led with purpose. The empire, still battered, had not fallen. And in the mountain passes of Armenia, a plan was unfolding, one that would tilt the balance of power. Rather than fight the Persians head-on in the plains of Syria or the lowlands of Mesopotamia, Heraclius struck where they were least prepared, the highlands of the Caucasus. His strategy was unconventional, daring, and deeply personal. The mountains of Armenia offered natural fortresses, winding roads, and narrow defiles perfect for ambushes and fast-moving campaigns. Heraclius, ever the student of terrain, moved with precision. He knew the old Roman roads, he used scouts drawn from local tribes, and he brought with him not just soldiers, but relics, icons, and clergy. This was not merely a military expedition, it was a procession of purpose. In 621, Heraclius launched his great campaign. Crossing into Armenia through the rugged Phasian region, he led his army deep into Persian-held territory. The Persian satraps, confident in their hold on the region, were caught off guard. Roman forces struck swiftly, capturing fortresses and outposts. Supplies were seized. Local resistance flared up in favor of the Byzantines. Persian forces, spread thin and unaccustomed to mountain warfare, struggled to respond. Heraclius's men moved like ghosts. They struck at night, vanished by dawn. They left messages etched on walls invoking the name of Christ and empire. Morale swelled. Word spread across Anatolia that the emperor was no longer hiding behind walls. He was out in the field, winning. Then came the campaign of 622. In a decisive push, Heraclius led a force from Trebizond eastward along the Black Sea coast, then turned south into the Persian rear. Cities surrendered, armies retreated, Persian commanders scrambled to reinforce their flanks. The impact was felt all the way in Ctesiphon. Khosrow, increasingly isolated and reliant on a shrinking circle of advisors, underestimated the danger. He believed the victories in Syria and Egypt had broken the Byzantines. But Heraclius had changed the game. In the spring of 622, at the Battle of Issus, yes, the same plains where Alexander had once triumphed, Heraclius won a major engagement against a Persian army under Shahin. Though not decisive in ending the war, it shattered the illusion of Persian invincibility. From the highlands of Armenia to the shores of Cilicia, the Roman eagle flew again. For the first time in nearly 2 decades, the East dared to hope. The gathering storm, shifting allegiances, and the battle for the heartlands, 623-625 CE. After Heraclius's successes in Armenia and Cilicia, the war entered a new and volatile phase. The emperor had proven he could strike Persian territory and win. Now, the question was, how far could he go? From 623 onward, Heraclius pursued a bold vision. No longer content with defending Roman lands, he sought to carry the war deep into the Persian heartlands. His aim was not just to win battles, but to break Khosrow's will to fight. In 623, Heraclius embarked on a personal campaign into northern Mesopotamia. He crossed into Atropatene, moving with a small but disciplined army. The deeper he marched, the more he relied on intelligence, local guides, and swift maneuvering. He sought not cities, but disruption, burning supply depots, severing roads, scattering garrisons. Khosrow responded with fury. He ordered a three-pronged assault to counter Heraclius's movements. Generals Shahin, Shahrbaraz, and Shahraplakan were each tasked with cutting off the emperor's advance, surrounding him in hostile territory. But Heraclius, ever adaptive, turned their plan against them. He feigned retreats. He divided his forces to draw them apart. In the region of Media, he ambushed Shahin's forces in a narrow valley, inflicting severe losses. The news of the Roman victory sent a wave of unease through the Persian command. Meanwhile, back in the west, Shahrbaraz had been tasked with a more dramatic mission, the capture of Constantinople itself. In 626, with support from the Avars and Slavs, he laid siege to the Byzantine capital, but the city, though weary, held fast. Roman naval superiority on the Golden Horn and the famed Theodosian walls proved unbreakable. The siege was repelled, and crucially, something changed. During the siege, Heraclius sent letters to Shahrbaraz, letters which were intercepted, then released, suggesting that Khosrow had ordered the general's execution. Whether forged or real, the letters sowed doubt. Shahrbaraz paused. He withdrew. He began secret communications with Heraclius. Persia's most capable general now stood on uncertain ground. Heraclius returned west in 625, cutting through Armenia once more and retaking strategic positions. His campaigns grew swifter, more daring. The balance had shifted. Though the war was far from over, Rome was no longer retreating. By 625, the empire stood bruised but reborn, and Khosrow, once the master of the East, now ruled a court cracking with mistrust. The final gambit, Heraclius's winter campaign and the fall of Dastagerd 626-627 CE. The siege of Constantinople had failed. The Avars retreated. The Slavs scattered, and Shahrbaraz, once Khosrow's most trusted general, had begun to shift allegiances. Heraclius, watching from afar, saw the time had come. It was the winter of 626. Most emperors would have waited for spring, but Heraclius, emboldened by success and driven by necessity, prepared his most audacious campaign yet. He would strike at the heart of Persia. He gathered an army from the eastern provinces, battle-hardened veterans, Armenian allies, and recruits from the Caucasus. With careful planning, he moved east, threading his forces through the mountain passes of the Zagros. In the dead of winter, Heraclius crossed into Persian territory, defying both terrain and tradition. Snow choked the roads, winds howled across the high plateaus, fires flickered low in camps carved into ice and rock. But the Romans pressed on. Their target was Dastagerd, Khosrow's great royal city northeast of Ctesiphon, a symbol of Sasanian strength. En route, Heraclius scattered detachments to harass Persian outposts, disrupt supply lines, and spread panic. Rumours swirled through the Persian countryside of the emperor from the west, who marched through snow and silence. In late 627, the armies met. At Nineveh, not far from the ruins of the Assyrian Empire, Heraclius faced a Persian force under Razad. The battle, fought across frozen fields under grey skies, was fierce. Persian cavalry charged, Roman infantry held. Heraclius himself led a decisive cavalry charge, an echo of old Roman valour. Razad was killed. His army broke. From there, the way to Dastagerd lay open. The city fell without a siege. Khosrow fled. Heraclius entered the royal palace and found treasures, correspondence, and symbols of imperial pride. The Roman banners were raised over halls once walked by kings. And yet, Heraclius did not press on to Ctesiphon. The Tigris, swollen by winter rain, stood in his path. His army, stretched thin, could go no further. But the damage was done. In the Persian court, fear turned to fury. Khosrow, already distrusted, now stood disgraced. Nobles whispered, generals withdrew. His own son, Shero, soon to be known as Kavad II, rose against him. Khosrow was imprisoned. Days later, he was executed. The great king who had once threatened Constantinople was dead. Heraclius, watching from afar, prepared for peace. Ashes and ashes, the Treaty of 628 and the illusion of peace. The war that had burned for over 2 decades seemed at last to flicker low. In 628, with Khosrow II dead, and the Persian Empire in disarray, Kavad II, known to history as Shero, offered terms of peace. His reign had begun not from triumph, but from revolt. His legitimacy rested on his ability to end a conflict that had left the land scorched and the treasury barren. Heraclius, weary yet victorious, accepted. The Treaty of 628 was drawn in haste, but honoured indeed. All Roman territories taken by Persia since 602 were to be returned: Syria, Palestine, Egypt, Mesopotamia, and parts of Anatolia. Even the True Cross, taken from Jerusalem years before, was promised to be returned to Constantinople. In many ways, it was a total Roman victory. Borders were restored, relics reclaimed. The empire had stood against annihilation and won. But the ground beneath both empires had shifted. The Persian Empire, gutted by war and court intrigue, fractured into civil war. Kavad II died mere months after the treaty, possibly from plague. His successors rose and fell in rapid succession. By 632, the once mighty Sasanian dynasty had descended into chaos, and in the west, Heraclius returned to his capital in triumph. The True Cross was carried in solemn procession through Constantinople. Bells rang, crowds wept. For the first time in a generation, peace seemed tangible. Yet beneath the surface, the empire too had changed. The wars had drained manpower and emptied coffers. Cities in the Levant lay in ruins. Trade routes were shattered, and the people, though grateful, were weary. The fields of Anatolia bore scars not from the plough but from the sword. Heraclius turned his mind to reform. He reorganized the eastern provinces, restructured taxation, and sought to mend ties between religious factions. His victories were framed not just as military triumphs but as divine providence. But as both empires nursed their wounds far to the south, in the deserts of Arabia, a new force had begun to rise. Unseen by either crown, a movement was stirring, one that would soon sweep across both their worlds. For now the banners of Rome and Persia fluttered in uneasy peace. A new crescent, the rise of Islam and the shifting sands, 629-636 CE. The peace between Rome and Persia had barely begun to settle when a new force emerged from the south. In 629 CE, Heraclius celebrated the return of the True Cross to Jerusalem. The crowds wept as he processed barefoot into the city, the sacred relic raised above him. The empire, battered but intact, rejoiced. And yet, while banners waved in the holy city, word began to spread, rumours of a new prophet among the Arabs. His name was Muhammad. What began as whispers soon echoed louder. Islam, the faith he preached, swept across the Arabian Peninsula with astonishing speed. By 632, Muhammad had unified the tribes of Arabia, and when he died, his followers did not scatter. They surged outward. The Byzantines and Persians, still licking their wounds from years of war, scarcely understood what was coming. In 633, Arab forces launched raids into Sasanian territory. These were no ordinary raids. They were swift, coordinated, and driven by religious zeal. By 634, they had penetrated Mesopotamia. The Persian court, already destabilized, could not rally a coherent defense. At the same time, Muslim forces under Khalid ibn al-Walid turned west, clashing with Byzantine troops in Syria. Heraclius, now in his late 50s, dispatched commanders to hold the frontiers. But his armies, though brave, were thinly stretched. Cities like Bosra and Damascus fell after fierce resistance. In 636 came the Battle of Yarmouk. Fought near the Yarmouk River in modern-day Jordan, it was a cataclysm. The Byzantine army, outnumbering the Arabs, fought for days against harsh winds and blinding dust. But strategy, morale, and terrain favoured the Muslims. By the end, the Roman field army was shattered. Heraclius, watching from Antioch, is said to have uttered, "Farewell, O Syria." The Levant, held by Rome for centuries, slipped away in a matter of months. To the east, the Sasanian Empire faced its own disasters. The Arab forces defeated them at Al-Qadisiyah and later at Nahavand, opening the gates to Ctesiphon. The empires that had stood for centuries, Rome and Persia, had been scarred by their own rivalries, and now, from the desert, a new power was reshaping the world. The tapestry trembled, not torn but rewoven, with new colours rising from the dust. Ghosts of empires, collapse, retreat, and the Arab conquests, 637-651 CE. The dominoes fell quickly now. In 637, the once mighty capital of the Sasanian Empire, Ctesiphon, was abandoned. The Arabs, having defeated the Persians at Al-Qadisiyah, crossed the Tigris and marched into the city. The palaces of kings, the halls of silver and ivory, stood empty. The crown jewels of Persia, symbols of centuries of imperial power, were carried away. Yazdegerd III, the last king of the Sasanian dynasty, fled east. What followed was a slow unravelling. Persia, already fractured by war, succession crises and plague, could not regroup. The nobles argued. Generals rebelled. City after city surrendered, some after battle, many by negotiation. In 642, at the Battle of Nahavand, Arab forces struck another blow. Persian resistance was crushed. It was the victory of victories, and with it the old order ended. The Sasanian Empire, heir to Achaemenid grandeur and Parthian might, dissolved into memory. Yazdegerd III wandered eastward, seeking allies among Central Asian tribes. He never returned. In 651, he was killed near Merv. The Persian court, once so grand, was gone. Meanwhile, to the west, the Byzantine Empire clung to its holdings. Heraclius died in 641. His successors, Constantine III, then Constans II, faced a shrinking world. Egypt fell in 642, struck by Arab forces under Amr ibn al-As. Alexandria, the jewel of the eastern Mediterranean, was taken after siege and surrender. Armenia, long a frontier of empires, was now caught between the weakening grip of Byzantium and the rising tide of Islam. In time, even the mountain passes bowed. And yet, in this grim chapter, there were glimmers of endurance. Though the Byzantines lost Syria, Palestine, and Egypt, they held Anatolia. Constantinople, ever defiant, stood behind its walls. The Roman navy maintained control of the Aegean. And, in the highlands and isles of the empire, old traditions persisted. For Persia, the conquest birthed transformation. Islam spread through former Sasanian lands. Arabic became the language of administration. But the soul of Persia, the poetry, the customs, the memory of Zoroastrian kings, lingered. The Roman-Persian wars had ended, not with treaty or triumph, but with transformation. The tapestry was torn at last, and from its fragments new stories began to weave. Echoes in the east, the Umayyads, and the Byzantine resistance, 651-680 CE. The world left behind after the collapse of the Sasanian Empire was unrecognizable. In 651, with Yazdegerd III's death, the last flicker of Persian royal fire went dark. The great empire of Ardashir and Khosrow had become part of a wider caliphate, administered from Medina and soon from Damascus under the Umayyads. But the story did not end. From the ashes of war, the Islamic Caliphate rose. It was not merely a military power, but an administrative machine, absorbing the bureaucratic skeletons of Rome and Persia alike. In former Persian lands, governors, walis, were appointed, taxes restructured, languages translated. The caliphs recognized that the might of an empire was not only in conquest, but in continuity. In the West, the Byzantine Empire did not collapse. It endured, though not unchanged. By 661, the Muslims controlled Syria, Egypt, and much of Mesopotamia. The Byzantines, under Constans II, sought to shore up what remained. Anatolia became the heartland, its themes, military provinces, hardened into a defensive shell. In 674, the Umayyad Caliph Muawiyah launched an ambitious siege of Constantinople. For years, Arab fleets raided the Aegean and the Sea of Marmara. The capital stood under threat, its walls manned day and night. But Byzantium had a secret: Greek fire. This mysterious incendiary weapon, hurled from ships and siphoned through copper tubes, turned the seas into walls of flame. The Arab fleets burned. The siege faltered. By 678, the Umayyads withdrew. The empire had survived. A treaty was signed. Tribute was agreed upon. But it was a momentary pause in a larger game. For the first time since the end of the Roman-Persian wars, the Byzantines had not only defended, they had pushed back. In the east, memories of Sasanian grandeur lingered in poetry, in ruins, in the hearts of old nobles now integrated into the caliphate's fabric. Persian identity, though politically subdued, was culturally unbroken, and in Constantinople, the Hagia Sophia still stood. Bells still rang. The dream of Rome, though battered, had not faded. Between fire and stone, rebellions, reforms, and the shadow of the caliphate, 680–700 CE. The fires of conquest had cooled, but the coals beneath still glowed. In 680, the death of Muawiyah I, the first Umayyad caliph, unleashed new turmoil within the caliphate. The succession of his son Yazid I sparked rebellion, most notably the revolt of Husayn ibn Ali, grandson of the Prophet Muhammad. At Karbala, Husayn fell, a martyrdom that would shape the soul of Shia Islam forever. The Byzantine Empire, though still under pressure, found space to breathe. Under Emperor Constantine IV, the defensive posture of the Byzantine state began to bear fruit. The themes of Anatolia, military districts led by strategoi, provided a network of resilience. Cities rebuilt walls, garrisons trained anew, and diplomacy returned as a tool of empire. In the east, the Persian cultural memory stirred once more. Though the Sasanian Empire had fallen, many Persian nobles had been absorbed into the Umayyad bureaucracy. Some converted, others held onto their heritage in private. Cities like Nishapur, Rai, and Isfahan pulsed with new life. Markets filled with both Arab administrators and Persian scholars. Arabic was now the language of law and learning. But Persian poetry persisted in quiet corners. By the 690s, the Umayyad caliphs renewed their efforts to expand. Abd al-Malik ibn Marwan, the new caliph, undertook sweeping reforms, minting Arabic coins, standardizing bureaucracy, and strengthening central control. His armies moved again into Armenia, the Caucasus, and deep into North Africa. And once more, war touched Byzantium. In 692, the Battle of Sebastopol saw Byzantine forces face the Umayyads. Though the Byzantines initially held strong, many of their Slavic auxiliaries defected mid-battle, and the tide turned. The loss strained the empire's hold over the eastern frontier, yet still it endured. In Constantinople, Justinian II rose to power, a fierce and often cruel ruler, but one determined to resist. Even in Persia, new tensions stirred. The memory of Zoroastrian fire temples, the lost palaces of Ctesiphon, and the dignity of old nobility created an undercurrent of resistance, not yet revolution, but not silence either. The war between Rome and Persia had ended, but the long shadow of rivalry, rebellion, and rebirth stretched on. A storm rekindled the fall and rise of emperors 707 or 17 CE. As the 8th century unfurled, storms swept across both sea and throne. In Constantinople, the imperial court saw turmoil. Justinian II, deposed and mutilated in 695, returned from exile in 705 with the help of Bulgar allies. His retribution was swift and severe. Enemies were executed, the city trembled, but his cruelty alienated even his supporters. In 711, he was overthrown and killed, ending the Heraclian dynasty. The throne passed from hand to hand. Philippicus, Anastasius II, then Theodosius III, emperors rising and falling like waves on the Bosphorus. Yet amid the chaos, something ancient stirred. The Umayyad Caliphate now, stabilized under Al-Walid I, looked once more to Byzantium. Fresh from victories in North Africa and Spain, the Caliphate's gaze returned east. In 712, Arab forces raided deep into Anatolia. Cities were besieged, fortresses tested. The Byzantines, lacking central leadership, struggled to respond. But the seeds of resistance had been planted. In 717, a new emperor emerged, Leo III, an Isaurian general of sharp mind and firm hand. He seized the throne from Theodosius III and began immediate preparations. For news had arrived. A great Arab army under Maslama ibn Abd al-Malik was marching toward Constantinople. It was to be no mere raid. It was a full-scale siege. Across Anatolia, villages were emptied as people fled toward the capital. The walls of Constantinople, standing for centuries, were reinforced. Grain was stored, cisterns filled, Greek fire was readied. By August, the siege began. The Caliphate's navy blockaded the Bosphorus. Maslama's army dug in across the Golden Horn. Yet Leo III stood firm. His leadership was cool, his defences thorough. Through the winter of 717-718, snow fell thick. Arab troops, unaccustomed to the bitter cold, suffered. Disease and famine spread. In spring, the tide turned. The Byzantine navy, wielding Greek fire, struck the Arab ships. A relief fleet from the Aegean slipped through. Bulgars attacked from the north, harassing the besiegers. By August 718, after 13 months, the Arabs lifted the siege. Thousands had died. The Caliphate withdrew in defeat. It was a turning point. Leo III had preserved the city, and with it, the Byzantine state. The empire breathed anew, battered but unbroken, and across the former lands of Rome and Persia, the rhythm of power began to shift once more. Icons and empires, faith, policy, and the wars within, 718-730 CE. The siege of 717-718 had ended, but the city's wounds would not heal easily. Leo III, the saviour of Constantinople, emerged as a reformer. His victory gave him not only prestige, but the authority to shape the empire more deeply. And shape it he did. He reorganized provincial defences, reaffirmed the thematic system, and restructured the empire's legal codes. But it was his religious policy that would define his reign and divide his people. In 726, Leo issued a decree banning the veneration of icons. The edict shocked many. For centuries, icons, images of Christ, the Virgin, and the saints, had been central to worship and devotion across the empire. People kissed them, lit lamps before them, and prayed through them. Leo saw them differently, influenced perhaps by Islamic aniconism or a desire to centralize control. He viewed icons as idolatrous. Churches were stripped. Riots broke out in Greece and the Aegean. Monks protested, bishops hesitated, and so began the iconoclasm, the war within. In the Caliphate, the Umayyads too were changing. After the failed siege, their focus shifted, east to Transoxiana, west into the Maghreb and the Iberian Peninsula. In Persia, Arab governors maintained firm control, but Persian culture continued to breathe beneath the surface. A strange silence had settled between the old empires. No great battles erupted between Byzantium and the Caliphate in these years, but the silence was tense. In Armenia and the Caucasus, both powers jockeyed for influence through vassals and alliances. In Cilicia, fortresses were rebuilt. Traders moved carefully, spies listened, and inside the Byzantine world, faith turned political. Patriarch Germanus of Constantinople opposed the emperor's decree and resigned. In the provinces, some bishops defied orders, continuing icon veneration in secret. Leo responded with firmness. He replaced bishops, silenced monasteries, and promoted loyal clergy. But the people remembered. Even as the armies trained and the walls of Constantinople stood strong, a different kind of war rumbled, one not of swords or ships but of belief, borderlands and breathing space, frontiers in flux 730–740 CE. By the early 730s, the once scorched borderlands of the Roman and Persian worlds had taken on new shapes, less battlegrounds now, more margins in flux. The Umayyad Caliphate, ever expanding, launched new campaigns into Anatolia. These were seasonal raids, swift, fierce, but often lacking the permanence of conquest. Cities like Tyana and Gangra were besieged or plundered, yet the Byzantines adapted. Fortified villages, mobile themes, and quick-response armies became the rhythm of defence. The land itself played a role. Mountains, forests, and rivers now acted as natural allies. In 740, a pivotal clash came, the Battle of Akroinon. Here, in the Phrygian highlands, Emperor Leo III's son, Constantine V, led the Byzantine forces. They met the Arab army in open battle, and for the first time in decades the Byzantines achieved a resounding field victory. Arab commanders were killed, their forces routed. The victory at Akroinon was more than a military success. It was a turning of the tide. It showed that the Byzantines were no longer merely survivors clinging to walls. They could meet their foes in the open. And behind the lines, change continued. In the east, the remnants of Persia simmered beneath the Umayyad surface. Zoroastrian rituals still flickered in remote temples. Persian literature, recited in whispers, remembered heroes and kings of old. Meanwhile, in Byzantium, Constantine V prepared to inherit more than a throne. He was stepping into a legacy of defence, reform, and inner division. Iconoclasm still raged. Monks were arrested, icons hidden or destroyed. Yet, amid this, the frontier held. The borderlands, Cappadocia, Cilicia, Armenia, became more than military zones. They were cultural crossroads, where Christian monks, Arab traders, Persian sages, and soldiers of every tongue passed through stone gates and dusty valleys. The war of empires had become a contest of endurance. And, though no treaties were signed and no clear victor crowned, a kind of balance emerged, shifting, breathing, poised between storm and silence. A new horizon, the Abbasid Revolution and shifting sands, 740–750 CE change came, not from without, but from within. The Umayyad Caliphate, stretched thin and increasingly resented, faced a storm it did not foresee. In the east, in the region of Khorasan, once a stronghold of Persian nobility, discontent festered. Local support coalesced around a new movement, the Abbasids. Claiming descent from Al-Abbas, uncle of the Prophet, they promised reform, justice, and the return of Islamic rule to its righteous path. But theirs was more than a religious appeal. They drew strength from Persian converts, disenfranchised Arabs, and ambitious generals. In 747, Abu Muslim, a figure as mysterious as he was brilliant, led a rebellion. Cities fell quickly. The black banners of the Abbasids rose high. By 750, the Abbasid army met the Umayyads at the Battle of the Zab River. The result was decisive. The Umayyads collapsed. Caliph Marwan II fled, only to be hunted down in Egypt. A new caliphate was born. The Abbasid victory marked more than just a change of dynasty. It shifted the axis of the Islamic world. The capital moved from Damascus to Baghdad, closer to the old Persian heartlands. Persian administrative traditions, literary styles, and courtly customs flooded into the Abbasid courts. The Byzantines, watching from afar, sensed the change but did not yet feel it directly. For them, the 740s were years of recovery and caution. Constantine V, now emperor, continued his military campaigns. Raids into Syria resumed, measured and tactical. Forts were rebuilt, roads patrolled. His iconoclastic policy continued to roil religious life, but his soldiers were loyal, and his borders relatively secure. In Armenia, buffer states shifted allegiance carefully, sensing the winds of change from the east. In the shadows, Persian culture began to rise again, not as empire, but as influence. In libraries, old Avesta fragments were studied. In court poetry, Persian metaphors wove through Arabic verse. The fire temples still flickered in the far reaches of the plateau. The Roman-Persian rivalry had become something else, no longer two titanic empires clashing, but cultures intertwining, echoing, reacting. And as the Abbasids laid the foundations of Baghdad, a city soon to rival Constantinople in splendour, the tapestry shimmered anew with threads of gold and ink, fire and thought, embers and mirrors, Byzantium, Baghdad, and the dance of influence 750–760 CE. The Abbasids were in power now, and Baghdad rose from dust like a vision out of myth. Founded in 762 but foreshadowed in intent and planning, the circular city was already being envisioned in the minds of Persian architects and Arab administrators alike. Set on the Tigris, it drew upon ancient memories of Seleucia, of Ctesiphon, of the old riverside, capitals that once bore the flame of Persia. But it was not merely memory that built Baghdad, it was ambition. In Byzantium, Emperor Constantine V continued his vigorous rule. Between battles and building projects, he tightened imperial control. His war on icons escalated. Monasteries were closed, land redistributed, and monks exiled or worse. But even as faith fractured, the frontier held. In the east, the Abbasids turned inward to solidify their regime. Abu al-Abbas, the first caliph of the new dynasty, ruled briefly. It was his brother, Abu Ja'far al-Mansur, who would truly mould the caliphate's shape. Under Mansur, the court turned its face to knowledge. Persian viziers rose in influence. Translators sought out Greek manuscripts, especially those of philosophy and medicine. From Alexandria and Antioch, works by Galen, Aristotle, and Ptolemy were carried east, studied, and preserved. The Byzantines noticed. Though political tensions remained, intellectual exchange crept through the cracks. Traders carried ideas with spices, captives brought tales and techniques. Even as armies clashed, physicians and mathematicians spoke a common tongue. On the Anatolian frontier, skirmishes resumed. Arab raids probed the Byzantine defences, testing the reorganised themes. Fortresses like Hadrianopolis and Amorium stood like sentinels on high plains, their bells ringing at the sight of dust clouds rising from the east. But there was no grand war, not yet. The rhythms had changed. No longer were Rome and Persia equals in force. They were mirrors, reflecting pieces of each other through language, culture, and adaptation. In Baghdad, scribes penned Arabic text on Greek geometry. In Constantinople, officials restructured court rituals that echoed Sasanian pomp. The dance had grown quieter, but no less meaningful. The quiet divide, legacy, language, and the end of an age. 760–800 the CE by 760 CE, the wars that had once thundered across empires had softened to scattered sparks, raids, responses, and uneasy calm. The Abbasid Caliphate, now firmly established, turned its gaze inward. Baghdad flourished, drawing scholars from across the world. Astronomers studied the stars from Persian observatories. Translators brought Aristotle to Arabic. Medicine, mathematics, music. They all blossomed under domes of learning. Persian influence pulsed in every brick and scroll. In Constantinople, Constantine IV's campaigns continued through Anatolia, but war with the Caliphate no longer held the fire of old. These were tactical manoeuvres, not existential clashes. The Byzantines fortified their eastern themes, trained cavalry for rapid deployment, and kept vigilant watch. But the siege warfare, the grand strategy of the Roman-Persian centuries, had faded. Instead, a cultural frontier emerged. The Byzantines, though still officially at odds with the Islamic world, now found themselves indirectly shaped by it. Dress, literature, administrative, structures, each bore hints of Persian legacy filtered through Arab rule. In the Abbasid realm, the ancient tongues whispered on. Middle Persian poetry transformed into early forms of New Persian. Fire temples remained in quiet valleys. Stories of Rustam and Jamshid, of Achaemenid kings and Sasanian palaces were told anew. Rome and Persia were no longer names for living states but lodestars in memory. The rivalry that had spanned centuries, through Parthian plains and Armenian passes, over Syrian deserts and along Euphrates' shores, had ended not with a treaty, but a transformation. The heirs of Rome were now Christian Greeks speaking a Roman tongue. The heirs of Persia were Muslim scholars speaking Arabic but dreaming in Persian verse. They no longer marched in legions and cataphracts against each other. Instead, they met in trade caravans, in scholarly debates, in whispered translations of lost wisdom. The Roman-Persian wars had shaped a continent. Their echo lasted long after the swords were sheathed, and so the tapestry comes to rest, not torn, but rewoven, its threads now crossing lands and languages, faded in places, brilliant in others, enduring in the quiet ways that history forgets to shout but never ceases to weave.